Level 1. The Twin Stranger. Reality contains patterns so impossible they shouldn't exist, yet they do, over and over again, in ways that make probability itself seem like a polite suggestion rather than an iron law. What you are about to hear over the next 2 hours are 100 documented coincidences so bizarre that they challenge everything you think you know about chance, fate, and the nature of reality itself. Starting with twins. In 1979, Jim Lewis met Jim Springer for the first time since their separation at birth, and discovered that both had married women named Linda, divorced them, then married women named Betty, that both had sons named James Allan, both had dogs named Toy, both drove the same model Chevrolet, both vacationed at the same beach in Florida, both worked as deputy sheriffs, both had workshops in their garages where they built furniture, and both suffered from the exact same pattern of tension headaches starting at age 18. These weren't vague similarities, but precise, specific, bizarrely identical life choices made independently by two men who shared DNA, but had never met, as if reality itself was running the same program twice to see if anyone would notice. Level 2. The Birthday Room. When you walk into a room of just 23 randomly selected people, there's a better than 50% chance that 2 of them share the exact same birthday. Not birth year, but the same month and day. Which feels completely wrong because there are 365 possible days and only 23 people. Yet the mathematics are irrefutable, and the phenomenon plays out constantly at parties, in classrooms, at business meetings where someone casually mentions their birthday, only to have another person gasp in recognition. This is the birthday paradox, and it works because we instinctively compare ourselves to the group as individuals rather than considering all possible pairs within the group. Meaning, in a room of 23 people, there are actually 253 possible pairs of people who could share a birthday, which suddenly makes the 50% probability seem not just possible, but inevitable. What's strange isn't that the math works, but that our brains are so thoroughly convinced it shouldn't, revealing how poorly calibrated human intuition is for probability, and how many things we dismiss as impossible coincidences are actually statistically mundane events dressed up in the costume of fate. Level 3. The Crimson Thread. You've probably noticed the number 23 appearing in your life with suspicious frequency, on clocks, receipts, addresses, license plates, and felt that eerie sensation that reality is trying to tell you something, which is exactly what Robert Anton Wilson explored in his Illuminatus trilogy, after becoming obsessed with the number's recurring appearance in everything from the date Julius Caesar was stabbed 23 times, to the fact that human DNA contains 23 chromosome pairs to the Titanic sinking on April 15th, which is 4 + 1 + 5, +1, +9 +1 +2, equaling 23. This phenomenon has a name: apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. But that clinical label doesn't quite capture the visceral experience of watching a specific number chase you through your days like a cosmic stalker, or explain why the number 23 specifically has captured the imagination of everyone from William Burroughs to Jim Carrey. The truth is that once you decide to notice any number, you'll see it everywhere. Not because it's appearing more frequently, but because your reticular activating system, the brain's attention filter, has been programmed to prioritize that pattern, turning random noise into apparent signal. Level 4. The Lottery Mirror. In September 2009, Bulgaria's national lottery drew the exact same 6 numbers: 4, 15, 23, 24, 35, 42 that it had drawn just 4 days earlier, an event so statistically improbable that it triggered a government investigation, parliamentary inquiries, and nationwide conspiracy theories. Yet, the mathematical truth is that this combination was exactly as likely to appear twice in a week as any other sequence would have been, because lottery balls have no memory, and each draw is completely independent of all previous draws. What made this coincidence feel impossible was the human tendency to assign special significance to repetition, while ignoring the fact that any other combination of 6 numbers would have been equally improbable. We just wouldn't have noticed or cared if the lottery had drawn 8, 12, 17, 29, 31, 44, 1 week and 3, 9, 18, 22, 33, 41 the next. The investigation found no fraud, no rigging, no conspiracy, just pure mathematical randomness doing what randomness does, which is occasionally cluster in ways that look designed. And the real lesson isn't about probability, but about how desperately humans need coincidences to mean something. Level 5. The Telephone Prophecy. Mark Twain was obsessed with a recurring dream in which he saw his brother Henry laid out in a metal coffin wearing a suit, with a bouquet of white flowers on his chest featuring a single crimson rose at the center. And when Henry died weeks later in a steamboat explosion, Twain walked into the room where his brother's body was displayed and saw the exact scene from his dream. The metal coffin, the suit, even the white flowers with the single red rose that a woman had placed there moments before Twain arrived. This wasn't a vague premonition or a detail added in hindsight. Twain had described the scene to multiple people before his brother's death, documented in letters that still exist, creating one of the most well-attested precognitive experiences in history. The skeptical explanation involves confirmation bias, false memory, and the sheer number of dreams people have that don't come true. But that explanation falters when confronted with the specific, documented details that Twain couldn't possibly have predicted through logic or intuition, leaving us with either an extraordinary coincidence or something much stranger about how time, consciousness, and causality actually work. Level 6. The Parking Space Angel. You've experienced this yourself, desperately needing a parking space in a crowded lot, feeling that specific flavor of stressed urgency, and then a car pulls out directly in front of you at the exact moment you arrive. So perfectly timed that it feels like the universe itself orchestrated the event specifically for your benefit. This happens often enough that some people develop entire belief systems around it, convinced they have a parking space angel or manifestation abilities, while skeptics dismiss it as pure selection bias, arguing that you only remember the times it worked and forget the dozens of times you circled endlessly. The interesting middle ground is that both explanations might be partially true. Yes, you're more likely to remember dramatic confirmations than boring failures. But also, if you're driving slowly and attentively while looking for a space, you naturally increase your chances of being in the right place when someone leaves, creating a feedback loop where your behavior actually does increase the likelihood of lucky timing. What feels like magic is often just probability meeting preparation, but that doesn't make the experience any less eerie when it happens. Level 7. The Book Falling Open. When you randomly open a book and your eyes land on exactly the sentence you needed to read at that exact moment in your life, addressing the specific question you'd been wrestling with, or providing the precise insight you'd been seeking, it creates such a powerful sense of meaningful connection that entire divination practices have been built around it. Bibliomancy, the practice of seeking spiritual guidance through random book passages, used for centuries with everything from the Bible to the I Ching. The rational explanation is straightforward. Books contain thousands of sentences covering universal human experiences, emotions, and situations. So the probability that at least one passage will feel personally relevant is actually quite high, especially when your brain is primed to find meaning and will creatively interpret vague statements to fit your circumstances. But this explanation, while mathematically sound, doesn't quite account for those uncanny moments when the relevance isn't vague at all but laser specific. When the random page addresses not just your general mood, but your exact situation using words that feel like they were written specifically for you, suggesting that either the universe has a sense of humor or human problems are far less unique than we imagine. Level 8. The Coffee Shop Collision. You run into someone you were just thinking about, not in a planned location, but randomly. At a coffee shop in a different city, in an airport terminal, walking down a street you never usually walk down. And the shock of that encounter feels like proof that thoughts have power, that thinking about someone can somehow summon them into your physical space, which is why people describe these moments with mystical language about manifesting or energy. The less magical explanation involves the sheer number of people you know combined with the limited number of places you're likely to be, creating mathematical overlap that feels unlikely but is actually statistically inevitable given enough time and opportunity. If you know 200 people and each of you visits 50 different locations per week, the number of potential coincidental encounters runs into the thousands annually, meaning you should expect several seemingly impossible meetings every year. What makes each instance feel special is the recency effect. You remember thinking about the person recently, but ignore the hundreds of other people you also thought about who you didn't randomly encounter, creating a false sense of mystical connection, when really you're just experiencing the law of truly large numbers in action. Level 9. The Airplane Seatmate. In 1953, a television reporter in California was covering the story of a hotel fire, and while interviewing witnesses, he met his own mother, whom he hadn't seen or heard from in years, who happened to be staying at that hotel on that specific night and evacuated at the exact moment he arrived to cover the story, creating a reunion neither had planned or expected through the mechanism of pure random chance. This type of coincidence, where major life reconnections happen through completely unrelated events, feels so impossible that it's tempting to invoke fate or destiny. Yet similar stories happen regularly enough that they're a recognized category of coincidence researchers study. The journalist had no reason to be at that hotel except the fire. His mother had no reason to be in California except a last-minute trip, and their paths crossed through a chain of causality so complex and unpredictable that no amount of planning could have orchestrated it. These moments reveal how much of life operates through chaos rather than pattern, how the events we consider most meaningful often arise from random collision rather than intentional design. Level 10. The Clock Synchronicity. When you glance at a clock and see 11:11 or 2:22 or 3:33, those repeating number patterns that seem to appear far more often than random chance should allow, you're experiencing what psychologist Carl Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that connect inner psychological states with outer physical events in ways that can't be explained by simple causation. Jung believed these weren't just confirmation bias or selective attention, but evidence of an causal connecting principle in the universe, a way that meaning itself could organize events without traditional cause and effect. Which sounds mystical until you realize that quantum physics has discovered similar non-causal correlations in particle behavior. The skeptical view is simpler. You check the time multiple times per day. Digital clocks display repeating numbers for 1 minute out of every approximately 6 hours, and your brain's pattern recognition system is hyper-tuned to notice symmetry and repetition while ignoring the thousands of non-repeating times you glanced at a clock. But even if the mechanism is entirely psychological, the experience of catching 11:11 right when you're thinking about a specific question or person still carries emotional weight, suggesting that what makes a coincidence meaningful isn't whether it's statistically special, but whether it arrives at a psychologically resonant moment. Level 11. The Lincoln-Kennedy Mirror. Abraham Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846, became the president in 1860, had a secretary named Kennedy who advised him not to go to the theater, was shot on a Friday while sitting beside his wife, and was succeeded by a Southern Democrat named Andrew Johnson, born in 1808, while John F. Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946, became president in 1960, had a secretary named Lincoln who advised him not to go to Dallas, was shot on a Friday while sitting beside his wife, and was succeeded by a Southern Democrat named Lyndon Johnson, born in 1908. Both presidents were assassinated by men known by 3 names: John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, both of whom were themselves killed before trial. Both assassins were born exactly 100 years apart, and both successors named Johnson were investigated for their potential involvement in the assassination. This list of coincidences has circulated for decades, and while some details have been exaggerated or fabricated in various retellings, the core parallels remain historically accurate and genuinely eerie, suggesting either that history has patterns or that human pattern recognition is so powerful it can find connections in any sufficiently large dataset. Level 12. The Falling Baby Miracle. In the 1930s in Detroit, a man named Joseph Figlock was walking down the street when a baby fell from a 4th-floor window and landed directly on him, cushioning the fall and saving the baby's life while Figlock suffered only minor injuries, which would be remarkable enough as a standalone incident. But exactly 1 year later, Figlock was walking down the same street when the same baby fell from the same window and landed on him again, creating what might be the most statistically improbable rescue in recorded history. The odds of being in the right place at the right moment to catch a falling human being are astronomically low. The odds of it happening twice with the same person, the same baby, and the same window approach mathematical impossibility. Yet both incidents were documented in contemporary newspaper accounts and verified by multiple witnesses. This suggests either that Figlock had extraordinarily bad luck in terms of being a human safety net, or extraordinarily good luck in terms of being positioned to prevent tragedy, depending on your perspective, and raises uncomfortable questions about whether some people might serve as unconscious agents of cosmic correction. Level 13. The Hoover Dam Deaths. The first man to die during construction of the Hoover Dam was J.G. Tierney, a surveyor who drowned on December 20th, 1922, while doing preliminary geological surveys for the dam site, and the last man to die during the dam's construction was Patrick Tierney, J.G. Tierney's son, who fell from one of the intake towers and died on December 20th, 1935. Exactly 13 years to the day after his father's death, in the same project that had claimed his father's life. This coincidence carries the particular cruelty of temporal symmetry, where the date itself becomes a kind of curse or marker, and raises questions about whether Patrick knew what day it was when he went to work that morning, whether he thought about his father, whether the anniversary added some microscopic distraction or emotional weight that contributed to the fatal moment. The Hoover Dam killed 96 workers during its construction, but these two deaths, first and last, father and son, same date 13 years apart, create a narrative bookend so perfect it feels almost scripted, as if the dam demanded symmetry in its blood price. Level 14, the Titanic Prophecy Book. In 1898, 14 years before the Titanic sank, a struggling writer named Morgan Robertson published a novel called Futility, about the largest ship ever built, an unsinkable luxury liner called the Titan, which struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic in April and sank with massive loss of life because it didn't carry enough lifeboats. The parallels are so precise they seem impossible. Both ships were about 800 feet long. Both displaced approximately 60,000 tons. Both could carry around 3,000 people. Both had triple-screw propellers. Both were described as unsinkable. Both struck icebergs on their starboard side. Both sank in the early morning hours, and both resulted in catastrophic death tolls because of insufficient lifeboats. Robertson wasn't a maritime expert or naval engineer. He was a fiction writer who somehow imagined, in specific detail, a disaster that wouldn't happen for another 14 years, leading some to suggest precognition, while others argue that any experienced sailor could predict such a disaster, given the reckless trajectory of early 20th century shipbuilding. The book was largely ignored until after the Titanic sank, at which point it was reprinted and became a bestseller, proving that tragedy has excellent marketing value. Level 15, The Curse of Tippecanoe. Every American president elected in a year ending in 0, starting with William Henry Harrison in 1840 and continuing for exactly 120 years, died in office. Harrison in 1841, Lincoln in 1865, Garfield in 1881, McKinley in 1901, Harding in 1923, Roosevelt in 1945, and Kennedy in 1963, creating what became known as the Curse of Tippecanoe, or the 20-year presidential curse, named after the battle where Harrison defeated the Shawnee chief Tecumseh, who allegedly cursed all future presidents elected in years divisible by 20. The pattern held perfectly for 7 presidents across more than a century, spanning natural deaths, assassinations, and illnesses, suggesting either a remarkable coincidence or something more mystical about cycles and numbers in American political history. Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980, survived an assassination attempt that should have killed him according to doctors, potentially breaking the curse, while George W. Bush, elected in 2000, also survived his full term despite a grenade attack and pretzel-choking incident, suggesting the pattern may have finally ended or simply paused. The curse demonstrates how humans create narratives from patterns, and how those narratives gain power through repetition and belief. Level 16, The Twin Cities Tragedy. In 2012, identical twin sisters in Ohio gave birth on the same day in different hospitals without planning it, and both babies died within hours of birth from unrelated complications. One from a heart defect, the other from respiratory failure, creating a synchronicity of both life and death that devastated both families simultaneously. The probability of identical twins conceiving and delivering on the same day is already low but possible, given biological similarities in their reproductive systems. But the additional coincidence of both births resulting in immediate infant death from different causes pushes the event into territory that feels less like statistics and more like cosmic cruelty. The twins reported feeling each other's labor pains despite being separated, and both described feeling a profound sense of shared loss that went beyond normal sibling grief. as if their identical biology created a linked experience of trauma. Medical examination found no common genetic factor that explained both infant deaths. They were genuinely separate, unrelated tragedies that happened to occur simultaneously to genetically identical mothers, leaving the families with no explanation beyond horrific coincidence and the unbearable weight of synchronized grief. The twins later had successful pregnancies, but both reported being terrified throughout those pregnancies that the pattern would repeat, showing how a single impossible coincidence can create lasting psychological trauma and expectation of recurrence. Level 17. The Bermuda Triangle Parallel. On December 5, 1945, 5 Navy torpedo bombers known as Flight 19 disappeared over the Bermuda Triangle during a training mission. And exactly 32 years later, on December 5, 1977, 5 commercial aircraft experienced simultaneous instrument failures while flying through the same region, all recovering safely but reporting identical malfunctions: compass spinning, altimeter fluctuations, radio static that matched the last transmissions from Flight 19 before they vanished. The temporal alignment of December 5th, combined with the 5 aircraft pattern and the matching technical failures, creates a coincidence that feeds directly into Bermuda Triangle mythology, suggesting the region might have temporal or magnetic anomalies that cycle on some unknown schedule. Skeptics point out that the Bermuda Triangle has approximately the same accident rate as any other high-traffic oceanic region, that most disappearances have mundane explanations involving weather and human error, and that confirmation bias leads people to remember the mysterious cases while forgetting the thousands of uneventful flights. But the date-specific pattern of Flight 19 and its anniversary echo, both involving groups of 5 aircraft experiencing similar phenomena, is harder to dismiss as pure randomness, occupying that uncomfortable space where coincidence becomes pattern. Level 18. The Edgar Allan Poe Prediction. In Edgar Allan Poe's only novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, published in 1838, 4 survivors of a shipwreck draw lots to determine who will be killed and eaten so the others can survive. And the unfortunate victim is a cabin boy named Richard Parker, who was then murdered and cannibalized by his desperate companions. 46 years later, in 1884, the yacht Mignonette sank, and its 4 survivors drifted in a lifeboat for weeks before drawing lots to determine who would be sacrificed. And the victim was a cabin boy named Richard Parker, who was then killed and eaten by the other survivors, creating an exact fictional-to-reality parallel that includes not just the narrative structure, but the specific name of the victim. This coincidence is so precise that it's tempting to suspect Poe had some precognitive vision. But the more mundane explanation is that Richard Parker was an extremely common name among English sailors, making it statistically likely that any real-life shipwreck cannibalism incident might involve someone with that name. Still, the identical role, cabin boy, and identical fate, death by lot and cannibalism, and identical name across nearly half a century creates a pattern that feels orchestrated rather than random. Level 19. The Impossible Reunion. In 2002, a woman named Laura Buxton, aged 10, released a balloon with her name and address attached as part of a school project in Staffordshire, England, and the balloon traveled 140 miles before landing in the garden of another house where it was found by another 10-year-old girl, also named Laura Buxton, who lived in a different county and had never heard of the first Laura. When the 2 Laura Buxtons met, they discovered they were both the same height. Both had brown hair in similar styles. Both owned a black Labrador retriever. Both had a guinea pig, a rabbit, and a hamster as pets. and both were wearing identical pink sweaters and jeans when they first met. The odds of a balloon traveling to a random location and finding someone with the exact same name are already low. The additional coincidences of age, appearance, pets, and clothing push the probability into territory that feels less like chance and more like simulation or design. The two girls became friends, and their story became international news, serving as one of those rare coincidences so well documented and mundane in context that skeptical explanations falter. There's no motive for fabrication, no pattern-seeking bias, just pure documented synchronicity that refuses to be explained away. Level 20. The Death Day Pattern. 3 of the first 5 American presidents, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Monroe, all died on July 4th, the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, with Adams and Jefferson dying on the exact same day in 1826, exactly 50 years after the document they helped create was adopted, while Monroe died 5 years later on July 4th, 1831. The symbolic weight of founding fathers dying on Independence Day feels too narratively perfect to be coincidental, leading to historical speculation about whether these men somehow willed themselves to survive until the meaningful date, holding on to life through determination until the calendar aligned with their legacy. This is actually medically possible. Studies have shown that people can sometimes delay death by hours or even days through sheer psychological willpower when motivated by an important event like a birthday, anniversary, or holiday, suggesting that consciousness has some limited veto power over the exact timing of death. Adams's last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives," not knowing that Jefferson had died earlier that same day, creating an additional layer of eerie synchronicity where the two men who had been political rivals and then reconciled friends died within hours of each other on the most symbolically important day in American history. Pause here for a moment. Let these patterns settle. Notice what you're already seeing differently in how people interact, how systems work, how your own mind operates. What comes next goes deeper. Stay with me. Level 21. The Archduke's License Plate. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, triggering World War I, and the license plate number on his car that day was A3118, which reads as Armistice November 11, 18. The exact date the war would end 4 years later, on November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., creating a coincidence so impossibly precise that it's been called the most eerie license plate in history. The car, a graph and stiffed double phaeton, still exists in a museum in Vienna, and the plate is authentic and documented in contemporary photographs, ruling out later fabrication or myth-making. Yet the probability of a random alphanumeric sequence encoding the exact end date of the war that assassination would trigger defies any rational calculation. Skeptics point out that you can find patterns in any license plate if you squint hard enough, that A3 doesn't really spell armistice without creative interpretation. But the 11-18 alignment with November 11, 1918 is harder to dismiss, especially given that the armistice was signed at the symbolic 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Whether this is precognition, cosmic humor, or the human tendency to find meaning in random alphanumeric strings, the coincidence has become inseparable from the mythology of World War I's beginning and end. Level 22. The Monk Who Saw Tomorrow. In 1139, Saint Malachy, an Irish archbishop, published a list of 112 cryptic Latin phrases that he claimed described every pope from his time until the end of the Catholic Church. And while many of the prophecies are vague enough to fit multiple interpretations, several are disturbingly specific, like describing Pope Urban VII, who reigned in 1590 as from the midst of food, because his family name was Castagna, which means chestnut, or Pope Pius XII as Pastor Angelicus, angelic shepherd, who led the church during World War II with noted compassion. The prophecies have been accurate enough that each papal election triggers renewed interest in what Malachi predicted, and according to his list, Pope Francis is either the last pope or the second to last, described as Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman, who will reign during a period of great tribulation before the final judgment. Historians argue that the prophecies were likely written much later and backdated to Malachi's time, making the early predictions merely historical descriptions dressed up as prophecy. But this explanation struggles with some of the later popes where the coincidences seem too specific to be pure chance or creative interpretation. Either Malachi had genuine prophetic vision, or the prophecies are a medieval forgery so skillfully crafted that they've influenced papal selection for centuries, or reality occasionally cooperates with predictions through mechanisms we don't understand. Level 23. The tank number. Curse. During World War I, a British Mark IV tank numbered 246 was involved in 3 separate incidents, where soldiers named Smith died. First, Lieutenant Smith was killed by artillery while commanding it in 1917. Then, Private Smith died when the tank caught fire in 1918. And finally, Corporal Smith was crushed by the tank's treads during maintenance in France weeks before the armistice. The number 246 tank became known as the Smith Killer among British tank crews, and some soldiers refused to serve on it, believing it was cursed or marked by death in some mystical way that targeted men with that specific surname. The rational explanation is that Smith is the most common surname in English-speaking countries, making it statistically inevitable that multiple Smiths would die in connection with any given piece of military equipment that saw extensive combat. But the fact that all 3 deaths occurred on the same tank, rather than being distributed across the hundreds of tanks in service, pushes the coincidence into uncomfortable territory. Tank 246 was eventually destroyed by German fire in October 1918, ending its career as a mobile tomb for men named Smith, and the incident became part of military folklore about cursed equipment and nominative determinism in warfare. Level 24. The Twin Towers. Prediction. In 1997, the television show The Simpsons aired an episode where the family plans a trip to New York City, and in one scene, Lisa holds up a magazine that reads $9, with the Twin Towers visible behind the number, creating the visual 9/11 4 years before September 11, 2001. This is one of dozens of alleged predictions in The Simpsons, a show that's been on air so long and produced so many episodes that it's statistically bound to occasionally align with future events through sheer volume. Yet, the specificity of this particular image, the Twin Towers, the number 9, the New York context, feels harder to dismiss as random convergence. The creators have stated it was pure coincidence, that the 9 referred to the price of the trip and the towers were simply iconic New York imagery. But the visual synchronicity has made this one of the most cited examples of fictional precognition in modern media. The broader question is whether long-running creative works eventually predict everything simply by covering enough scenarios, or whether there's something about the creative process that occasionally taps into future probabilities in ways that appear prophetic only in retrospect, when the context makes the connection visible. Level 25. The Bullet That Waited. Henry Ziegland broke up with his girlfriend in 1883, and her distraught brother shot at him in revenge, but the bullet only grazed Ziegland's face and embedded itself in a tree on his property in Texas, where it remained lodged for 20 years. In 1913, Ziegland decided to cut down that tree, and, finding it too difficult to chop by hand, he used dynamite to blast it, which detonated the long-buried bullet, sending it flying directly into Ziegland's head, killing him instantly with the same bullet that had missed him 2 decades earlier. This story has all the hallmarks of cosmic justice or delayed fate, as if the universe insisted that the bullet complete its original mission regardless of how long it took, creating a narrative so perfect that it's been retold in various forms and locations with different names, making some historians suspect it's an urban legend rather than documented fact. However, contemporary newspaper accounts from Texas do reference a similar incident, suggesting that even if details were embellished over time, something resembling this extraordinary delayed execution actually occurred. The coincidence speaks to our deep narrative hunger for symmetry and justice. The idea that causes eventually find their effects even across decades of separation. Pause here for a moment. Let these patterns settle in your mind. Notice what you're already seeing differently. How coincidence and probability dance together. How meaning emerges from chaos. How history contains stranger patterns than fiction ever could. What comes next shifts from the familiar into deeper territory, where the coincidences become more analytical, more mechanical. Stay with me. Level 26. The Tamerlane Curse. When Soviet archaeologists opened the tomb of Tamerlane, the 14th century Mongol conqueror, in Samarkand, on June 21, 1941, they found an inscription warning that whoever disturbed his rest would unleash an invader more terrible than Tamerlane himself, and the local Muslim elders begged them not to proceed, but they opened the tomb anyway. Exactly 1 day later, on June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, sending 3 million troops across the Soviet border in a campaign that would kill 27 million Soviet citizens. The temporal alignment, opening the tomb of history's greatest conqueror and immediately triggering an invasion of unprecedented scale, created instant mythology among Soviet soldiers and citizens. And Stalin himself reportedly ordered Tamerlane's remains to be reburied with full Islamic honors in 1942, after which the tide of war began to turn in the Soviet favor at Stalingrad. Rational historians dismiss this as coincidence amplified by wartime superstition, noting that the Nazis had been planning Barbarossa for months, and its launch had nothing to do with archaeological excavations in Uzbekistan. But the symbolic resonance, disturbing the conqueror's rest and immediately suffering conquest, proved more powerful than logic, demonstrating how coincidence becomes myth when it aligns with collective anxiety and narrative need. Level 27. The Nantucket Whaling Coincidence. In 1820, the whaling ship Essex was attacked and sunk by a sperm whale in the Pacific Ocean, and the survivors resorted to cannibalism during their months-long ordeal in lifeboats, which directly inspired Herman Melville to write Moby Dick in 1851. 30 years after the Essex sinking, in 1850, one of the survivors named Owen Chase wrote his own account of the disaster, and when Melville's ship encountered a whaling vessel at sea, he went aboard and discovered that the captain's son had a copy of Chase's manuscript, and that captain was the son of Owen Chase himself, creating a perfect circle of coincidence where Melville met the offspring of the man whose story would inspire his greatest work in the middle of the ocean, on a random encounter between two ships. The probability of this meeting, specific ships, specific ocean, specific relationship, specific manuscript, approaches the infinitesimal, yet it's documented in Melville's journals and letters. This coincidence raises questions about whether certain stories exert gravitational pull, whether narrative itself creates probability fields that draw related elements together, or whether the ocean is simply small enough that whaling vessels in the 1850s were bound to encounter each other eventually, making the coincidence feel more impossible than it actually was. Level 28, the Amber Room. Parallel, the Amber Room, called the Eighth Wonder of the World, was a chamber decorated entirely in amber panels that took 10 years to construct in Prussia. Was given to Peter the Great in 1716. Disappeared when the Nazis looted it during World War II, and despite decades of searching has never been found. In 2003, a perfect replica of the Amber Room was completed in St. Petersburg at enormous cost, using photographs and descriptions to recreate what was lost, and within weeks of its opening, a fire broke out in the room due to faulty electrical wiring. The exact same way the original Amber Room was believed to have been destroyed by the Nazis, either deliberately or accidentally during the war. The temporal coincidence, spending decades and millions to recreate a lost treasure, only to have it nearly destroyed by the same method that supposedly destroyed the original within weeks of completion, suggests either that the room itself carries some curse of fire, or that humans are remarkably consistent in making the same electrical safety mistakes regardless of historical context. The replica was saved and restored, but the incident reinforced the mythology around the Amber Room as an object that resists permanent existence, that perhaps wants to remain lost, that punishes attempts to resurrect it through the same mechanism that destroyed it originally. Level 29. The Chromosome Convergence. In 1866, Gregor Mendel published his work on genetic inheritance, showing that traits pass through discrete units from parent to offspring. And in the same year, completely independently, Friedrich Miescher discovered DNA while studying white blood cells, creating a perfect simultaneous breakthrough where the theoretical framework of heredity and the physical mechanism of heredity were discovered at the exact same time by scientists who never communicated and were working on entirely different problems. This type of simultaneous discovery happens regularly in science. Newton and Leibniz both invented calculus independently. Darwin and Wallace both proposed natural selection simultaneously, and Einstein was only months ahead of other physicists in publishing relativity, suggesting that scientific breakthroughs aren't individual genius moments, but rather inevitable consequences of available knowledge reaching critical mass. When the tools, data, and conceptual frameworks align, multiple minds arrive at the same truth independently, like water finding identical paths down a mountain. The coincidence isn't mystical, but reveals something about how knowledge accumulates and how certain discoveries become inevitable once prerequisite understanding exists, making genius less about unique vision and more about being positioned at the convergence point of available information. Level 30. The name Prophecy Engine. Nominative determinism is the hypothesis that people tend to gravitate toward professions that fit their names, and while much of it is pattern-seeking bias, there are documented cases so specific they border on uncanny, like a urologist named Dr. Dick Chop, who specializes in vasectomies, meteorologists named Sarah Blizzard and Amy Freeze, a Lord Chief Justice of England named Iger Judge, or the aptly named Thomas Crapper, who didn't invent the toilet but did popularize the flush mechanism. The statistical question is whether these are pure coincidences amplified by confirmation bias, We remember Dr. Dick Chop, but forget the thousands of urologists whose names have no connection to their specialty. Or whether names actually exert subtle psychological pressure on career choices through a lifetime of associations, jokes, and unconscious identity formation. Studies have shown weak but measurable correlations between names and professions, suggesting that nominative determinism might be real at population levels, even if any individual case could be coincidence. The truly eerie cases are the ones where the name-profession match is so perfect and specific that randomness seems insufficient, like an orthopedic surgeon named Dr. Bonebreak, or a dermatologist named Dr. Rash, making you wonder whether these people chose their specialty because of their name or despite it, and whether that choice was truly free or subtly determined by a lifetime of nominative priming. Level 31. The Concurrent Construction. The Great Pyramid of Giza and Stonehenge, despite being separated by approximately 2,500 miles and built by cultures with no known contact, were both constructed around 2560 BCE using massive stone blocks, transported across enormous distances with no wheels or metal tools, both aligned precisely to astronomical phenomena. Both required organizational systems capable of coordinating thousands of workers for decades, and both demonstrate mathematical sophistication that supposedly didn't exist in that era, according to traditional historical timelines. The coincidence isn't just that two ancient cultures built impressive monuments at the same time. Civilizations rise and build things, but that they independently arrived at such similar solutions to architectural problems, suggesting either that human ingenuity follows predictable patterns when confronted with similar challenges, or that there was far more cultural exchange in the ancient world than we've discovered evidence for. Some theorists push further into ancient astronaut territory, proposing that both cultures were influenced by external intelligence. But the more mundane explanation is that humans separated by geography, but connected by universal physics and mathematics, will independently discover similar engineering principles when motivated by religious devotion and hierarchical power structures capable of mobilizing massive labor forces. Level 32. The Typhoon that saved Japan. In 1274 and again in 1281, the Mongol Empire launched massive invasion fleets to conquer Japan, and both times, 7 years apart, enormous typhoons destroyed the majority of the invasion force just as they approached Japanese shores. Storms so perfectly timed and devastating that the Japanese called them kamikaze, or divine wind, believing the gods themselves were protecting Japan from foreign conquest. The probability of two separate military invasions, planned years apart, both being destroyed by typhoons at the critical moment of engagement, is astronomically low. Yet both events are thoroughly documented in Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, and Japanese historical records. The Mongols had conquered most of the known world using superior tactics and organization, but they couldn't predict or defend against weather, and Japan's geography placed it directly in the path of seasonal typhoon activity that peaks in late summer and early autumn, exactly when the Mongol fleets arrived. This coincidence shaped Japanese national identity for centuries, reinforcing the idea of divine protection and cultural uniqueness, while demonstrating how random meteorological events can determine the course of civilizations, making weather patterns as historically significant as military genius or political strategy. Level 33. The Orchestra of Death. The Titanic's musicians famously played as the ship sank, and in 2012, exactly 100 years after the Titanic disaster, the Costa Concordia cruise ship struck rocks and began sinking off the Italian coast while the ship's musicians were performing. and they too continued playing even as passengers evacuated, creating an eerie centennial echo of the Titanic's most iconic image. Both ships were considered engineering marvels of their respective eras. Both struck obstacles due to human navigational error combined with overconfidence in technology. Both had captains who abandoned ship while passengers were still aboard, and both had musicians who maintained professional composure in the face of disaster. The temporal coincidence, exactly 100 years, combined with the parallel behavior of the musicians, creates a pattern that feels less random and more like history, deliberately repeating itself to make a point about human nature, remaining constant across centuries of technological change. The musicians on both ships made the same choice separated by a century: to provide calm through music, while chaos unfolded around them, suggesting that certain human responses to crisis are hardwired deeply enough that they transcend culture and time, manifesting identically when circumstances align. Level 34. The Volcanic Synchronicity. Mount Vesuvius famously destroyed Pompeii on August 24, 79 AD, and exactly 1,340 years later on August 24, 1419. Mount Vesuvius erupted again in one of its most violent explosions since the Pompeii disaster. Then, on August 24, 1872, Vesuvius erupted yet again with significant violence. The probability of a volcano that erupts irregularly, sometimes decades apart, sometimes centuries, repeatedly choosing the same calendar date for major eruptions defies statistical explanation, unless there's some astronomical or geophysical trigger associated with late August that we don't understand, some annual stress pattern in Earth's crust or planetary alignment that creates favorable conditions for eruption. Volcanologists have found no mechanism that would cause date-specific eruptions, and Vesuvius has also erupted on many other dates throughout history. But the August 24th cluster is documented and real, creating one of those coincidences where natural phenomena seem to follow patterns that feel intentional, even though geology has no memory or consciousness. It's possible that record-keeping bias plays a role. Scribes more likely to record August 24th eruptions because of the Pompeii anniversary. But the physical evidence of eruption layers supports multiple August events, leaving us with an unexplained temporal pattern in volcanic activity. Level 35. The Twin Strangers Experiment. In 2015, a photographer in Ireland created a project to find people's doppelgangers, unrelated individuals who look remarkably similar, and discovered multiple pairs of people living in the same city who had never met despite looking nearly identical, sharing facial features, body types, and mannerisms so similar that they could be mistaken for twins. The mathematical probability that two genetically unrelated people would develop such similar facial structures is low but not impossible. With 8 billion people on Earth, coincidental resemblance is statistically inevitable. Yet the clustering effect, where doppelgangers often live in geographic proximity, despite having no family connection, suggests something beyond pure randomness. One pair discovered they had been at the same concert on the same night 3 months before meeting. Another pair found photographs showing they had unknowingly stood near each other at a public event years earlier, creating layered coincidences where not only do the people exist, but their paths nearly crossed multiple times before conscious awareness. This raises questions about whether physical similarity creates unconscious behavioral patterns. Similar faces leading to similar social treatment, leading to similar lifestyle choices leading to geographic clustering. Or whether we're simply noticing a handful of matches while ignoring the billions of people who have no doppelganger at all. Level 36. the Assassination Parallel. On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated while riding in a motorcade through Dallas, and exactly 11 years earlier, on November 22, 1952, Kennedy's wife Jackie suffered a miscarriage that deeply traumatized her and threatened their marriage, creating a personal tragedy to public tragedy anniversary that JFK himself was aware of on the morning he died. Kennedy reportedly mentioned to Jackie that morning that it was the anniversary of the miscarriage, showing he tracked the date consciously, which adds a layer of psychological weight to the coincidence. He died on the same calendar date that marked one of his family's deepest private sorrows. This type of temporal alignment between personal and historical tragedy appears throughout Kennedy's life. His older brother, Joe Kennedy Jr., died in World War II on August 12, 1944, and JFK's son, Patrick, died from lung complications on August 9, 1963, just 3 months before JFK's assassination, creating another near anniversary of family death. Whether these date alignments mean anything beyond pattern seeking is unclear, but they demonstrate how certain dates can become weighted with significance, how anniversaries create psychological touchstones that make coincidences feel less random and more like fate circling back to complete unfinished business. Level 37. The writer's Precognition. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe wrote the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, featuring 4 shipwreck survivors who draw lots and cannibalize a cabin boy named Richard Parker. And 46 years later, in 1884, the yacht Mignonette sank, and its 4 survivors drew lots and cannibalized a cabin boy named Richard Parker. But Poe's uncanny predictions didn't stop there. In 1845, Poe wrote the facts in the case of M. Valdemar, describing a man placed in mesmeric trance at the moment of death, who exists in suspended animation for months, and in 1846, multiple newspapers reported the story as factual news before Poe clarified it was fiction. But then, in 1864, a French doctor claimed to have performed the exact experiment Poe described, keeping a dying patient in hypnotic suspension. Poe wrote The Balloon Hoax in 1844 about crossing the Atlantic by hot air balloon, which wouldn't be accomplished until the 1970s, but which Poe described in such technical detail that engineers later confirmed his fictional design would actually work. The pattern suggests either that Poe had extraordinary intuitive understanding of probability and future technological development, or that creative fiction sometimes accesses precognitive information through mechanisms we don't understand, or simply that any writer prolific enough will occasionally predict the future through sheer volume of imaginative output. Level 38. The Bridge Number. Curse, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, nicknamed Galloping Gertie, collapsed spectacularly on November 7, 1940, due to wind-induced oscillation, and when engineers built its replacement, they assigned it the designation Bridge Number 5401. And exactly 60 years later, on November 7, 2000, the new bridge's construction was completed and opened to traffic on the anniversary of the original bridge's collapse. This wasn't planned symmetry or intentional memorial timing, but pure calendrical coincidence discovered only after construction finished, creating an eerie bookend where destruction and resurrection of the same bridge occurred on the same date, 6 decades apart. Engineering records show that the November 7th completion date resulted from weather delays and bureaucratic processes with no connection to the anniversary. Yet the temporal alignment felt significant enough that the opening ceremony incorporated acknowledgement of the original bridge's failure. The coincidence demonstrates how dates can become haunted by their historical associations. How November 7th transformed from an arbitrary point on the calendar into a meaningful anniversary through disaster, and how humans retrospectively assign significance to temporal patterns even when those patterns arose through completely independent causal chains. Level 39. The Earthquake Twins. On September 19, 1985, a magnitude 8.0 earthquake devastated Mexico City, killing over 10,000 people and becoming one of the deadliest natural disasters in Mexican history. And exactly 32 years later, on September 19, 2017, another major earthquake struck Mexico City with magnitude 7.1, killing hundreds and collapsing buildings in areas that had been rebuilt after the 1985 quake. The temporal coincidence, same city, same date, 32 years apart, was made even more eerie by the fact that Mexico City conducts annual earthquake drills on September 19th to commemorate the 1985 disaster, meaning that just hours before the 2017 earthquake, millions of people had practiced evacuation procedures while consciously remembering the anniversary of the previous earthquake. Some people were still in the streets from the drill when the real earthquake began, creating a surreal collapse of simulation and reality. Seismologists confirmed there's no geological mechanism that would cause date-specific earthquakes, that tectonic stress accumulates and releases on timescales that have nothing to do with human calendars, making the September 19th coincidence purely random from a physical perspective. Yet the psychological impact of experiencing disaster on its own anniversary created a collective sense of fate or curse that no amount of scientific explanation could fully dispel. Level 40. The actor's death scene. Brandon Lee, the son of martial arts legend Bruce Lee, died on March 31, 1993, when a prop gun fired a real bullet during filming of The Crow, a movie about a musician who returns from the dead to avenge his murder. And the specific scene being filmed when Lee died was his character's death scene, meaning Lee died while acting out his own death, creating a horrifying collapse of fiction and reality. But the coincidence deepens. Brandon's father, Bruce Lee, died in 1973 under mysterious circumstances while filming Game of Death, a movie about a martial arts actor who fakes his death, and Bruce Lee's character in that film was shot and killed, meaning both father and son died while making movies that featured their characters' deaths, separated by exactly 20 years. The prop gun that killed Brandon Lee malfunctioned in a way that had never happened before or since in Hollywood history. A perfect storm of negligence and mechanical failure that occurred at the precise moment he was performing a death scene, as if reality and fiction became confused about which domain governed the moment. The Lee family tragedies created mythology about cursed bloodlines and karmic patterns, but from a rational perspective, they demonstrate how dangerous film sets can be when safety protocols fail, and how coincidental timing can transform tragedy into something that feels supernatural. Level 41. The Hotel California Prophecy. In 1976, the Eagles released Hotel California with the lyric, "We haven't had that spirit here since 1969. And in 1969, exactly 7 years before the song's release, the Manson family murders occurred in Los Angeles, marking the symbolic end of the 1960s peace movement and the death of the hippie dream that the song mourns. Don Henley has stated the 1969 reference was intentional and connected to Altamont and the cultural shift. But what's eerie is that the song describes a hotel you can check out of but never leave. And the address mentioned in some interpretations, Camarillo, was the location of a state mental hospital where many Manson followers and acid casualties ended up, creating layers of coincidental geographic and temporal specificity that the songwriters claim were unintentional. The song became an anthem about disillusionment and the dark side of the California dream at the exact cultural moment when that disillusionment was peaking, as if the music captured something in the zeitgeist before the culture fully recognized what it was feeling. Whether this is artistic prescience, coincidence, or simply skilled observation of cultural trends is debatable. But the song's enduring resonance suggests it tapped into something real about American consciousness in the 1970s, making it feel prophetic even if it was simply well-timed cultural criticism. Level 42. The Curse of the Ninth. Beethoven, Schubert, Dvorak, Bruckner, and Mahler all died either during or immediately after completing their Ninth Symphony, creating a superstition so powerful among composers that some deliberately avoided writing a ninth or used tricks to bypass it. Mahler called his Ninth Symphony Das Lied von der Erde, the Song of the Earth, hoping to fool fate, then died shortly after completing what he finally labeled his Ninth Symphony. Arnold Schoenberg was so terrified of the Ninth Symphony curse that he wrote about it extensively, pointing out the pattern of great composers dying at their ninth, and then he himself died while working on an opera, having carefully avoided completing a Ninth Symphony. The statistical question is whether this pattern is real or confirmation bias. We remember the composers who died at their ninth while forgetting those who wrote 10 or 12 symphonies and died of old age. But the clustering of major composers around the number 9 is documented, and strange enough that it influenced compositional decisions for over a century. One explanation is that symphonies are massive creative undertakings that take years to complete, and by the time a composer reaches their ninth, they're often elderly and physically exhausted, making death from natural causes more likely, but this doesn't explain why the pattern holds so precisely at 9, rather than distributing randomly across 8th, 9th, 10th, or 11th symphonies. Level 43. The Rocket Equation. Parallel. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in Russia, Robert Goddard in America, and Hermann Oberth in Germany, all independently derived the same fundamental rocket equation in the early 1900s, without knowing about each other's work, each arriving at identical mathematical descriptions of how rockets achieve thrust in vacuum by expelling mass, proving that when the underlying physics is understood and the tools of calculus are available, certain equations become inevitable discoveries. What makes this coincidence particularly striking is that all three men were considered cranks by their contemporary scientific establishments. All three published their work within a decade of each other, and all three would later be recognized as the founding fathers of space travel, their independently derived equations forming the theoretical foundation for every rocket launched in human history. This simultaneous discovery pattern reveals something profound about how knowledge develops. Breakthroughs aren't individual genius striking like lightning, but rather the inevitable result of conceptual frameworks reaching maturity, where multiple minds working on the same problem with the same tools will arrive at the same truth. The rocket equation was waiting to be discovered, and once the prerequisite understanding of physics and mathematics existed, it appeared to three different people in three different countries as if reality itself was ready to reveal that particular secret. Level 44. The Replacement Coincidence. When James Dean died in a car crash in 1955, his Porsche 550 Spider, nicknamed Little Bastard, was purchased by a doctor who wanted to use it for parts, and the car's engine was installed in another race car, which then crashed, killing the driver, while the transmission was installed in a different race car which also crashed, injuring the driver. And when the shell of Dean's original Porsche was later displayed in Sacramento, it fell off its mount and broke a teenager's hip. Then the car was loaded onto a truck for transport, and the truck driver was killed when the Porsche fell onto him. The car's curse mythology grew until the Porsche finally disappeared in 1960 while being transported by train, never to be recovered despite a $1 million reward for its discovery, as if the cursed object finally removed itself from reality to prevent further deaths. Skeptics point out that race cars crash frequently, that vintage car parts are installed in other vehicles all the time, and that coincidental accidents around a famous object get remembered while thousands of non-coincidental accidents get forgotten. But the concentration of deaths and injuries specifically connected to Dean's Porsche parts over just 5 years suggests either genuine curse or an extraordinary cluster of bad luck that defies comfortable explanation. Level 45. The Twin City Disaster. On April 18, 1906, San Francisco was devastated by a massive earthquake and fire that destroyed most of the city. And exactly 100 years later, on April 18, 2006, San Francisco experienced a significant earthquake swarm and minor tremors that, while not catastrophic, created widespread alarm, specifically because of the centennial anniversary, as if the Earth was acknowledging its own calendar. Seismologists confirmed there's no mechanism for earthquakes to occur on anniversary dates. Tectonic plates don't track human calendars. Yet, residents reported an eerie feeling when the 2006 tremors began on the exact anniversary of the city's greatest disaster, many having attended memorial services that morning commemorating the 1906 quake. The psychological impact of experiencing seismic activity on the centennial of catastrophic seismic activity created a collective sense of temporal repetition, even though the 2006 event was minor compared to 1906's magnitude 7.9 destruction. This coincidence demonstrates how humans impose narrative patterns onto geological phenomena, how we interpret random natural events through the lens of historical memory and symbolic meaning, creating stories about the Earth remembering, when in fact it's only human consciousness that remembers and projects that memory onto random coincidence. Level 46. The Author's Death. Match: Aldous Huxley, C.S. Lewis, and John F. Kennedy all died on November 22, 1963. The same day, with Huxley dying in Los Angeles, Lewis dying in Oxford, and Kennedy being assassinated in Dallas, meaning 3 of the most influential figures of the 20th century in literature, philosophy, and politics died within hours of each other, despite having no connection and being separated by thousands of miles. The Kennedy assassination dominated news coverage so completely that Huxley and Lewis's deaths were barely reported, creating an additional coincidence where 2 major cultural figures died in the shadow of a third. Their deaths erased from public consciousness by the sheer magnitude of the presidential assassination. Peter Kreeft later wrote a fictional dialogue imagining the 3 men meeting in the afterlife, turning the coincidence into philosophical meditation. But the raw statistical improbability of 3 such historically significant individuals dying on the same day remains striking. The November 22nd date carries no special significance that would explain the cluster. It's not an equinox, solstice, or historically resonant anniversary, making the triple death pure calendrical coincidence that nevertheless feels weighted with meaning simply because of who the 3 men were and what they represented. Level 47. The Titanic survivors return. Violet Jessop survived the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, then served as a nurse on the Titanic's sister ship, the Britannic, which hit a mine and sank in 1916, making her one of the few people to survive two major maritime disasters involving sister ships from the same line. But the coincidence deepens. Jessup was also aboard the Olympic, the third sister ship, in 1911 when it collided with the HMS Hawk and nearly sank, meaning she experienced catastrophic incidents on all three Olympic-class vessels: Titanic, Britannic, and Olympic. The only person known to have been aboard all three during their respective disasters. The probability of being randomly assigned to all three sister ships during the specific voyages when each experienced catastrophe is astronomically low, leading some to call her Miss Unsinkable, while others suggested she was cursed or somehow attracting disaster. Jessup herself seemed aware of the eerie pattern, writing in her memoir about feeling a strange sense of fate connecting her to the doomed ships. But she continued working at sea for decades afterward, surviving World War I and living until 1971, proving that whatever coincidental pattern connected her to maritime disaster, it wasn't ultimately fatal. Level 48, the comic book prediction. In 1996, Marvel Comics published a storyline where the Avengers fought a villain who destroyed the World Trade Center towers using hijacked aircraft, showing the towers collapsing in illustrated panels that depicted smoke, debris, and people fleeing, 5 years before September 11, 2001. The comic was pulled from circulation after 9/11 due to the disturbing similarity, but copies still exist, showing the eerie visual match between fictional destruction and real catastrophe, both involving planes and the Twin Towers in nearly identical compositions. Comic book writers routinely destroy famous landmarks for dramatic effect. The Statue of Liberty, Empire State Building, and other New York icons appear ruined in countless stories. So, hitting on a method of destruction that later occurs in reality is statistically possible given enough creative output. But the specific match of aircraft plus Twin Towers plus collapse imagery created such uncomfortable resonance that it felt less like coincidence and more like precognition. The writer and artist reported receiving hate mail accusing them of either predicting or somehow inspiring the attacks, demonstrating how coincidences involving tragedy can become emotionally charged and morally complicated, where fictional imagination accidentally matching real horror creates guilt and paranoia, even when there's clearly no causal connection. Level 49. The Apollo 13 numbers. Apollo 13 launched on April 11, 1970, at 1313 military time, experienced its catastrophic oxygen tank explosion on April 13th, and the mission's official designation was SA-508, which adds to 13, 5 plus 0 plus 8, creating a clustering of the number 13 so dense around the mission that it fed superstitions about cursed numbers despite NASA's supposedly rational culture. The oxygen tank that exploded was in Service Module 13. The explosion occurred 13 minutes after the crew finished a TV broadcast, and the mission was the 7th manned mission in the Apollo program, with 7 being considered lucky while 13 is unlucky, creating a symbolic tension between fortunate and unfortunate numbers. NASA officially dismissed numerological interpretation as nonsense, pointing out that they'd scheduled the launch time for technical reasons unrelated to digits and that the explosion resulted from a damaged heating coil plus procedural errors, not cosmic punishment for launching a 13th mission. But the numerical clustering around Apollo 13 remains documented fact. And whether it means anything beyond human pattern recognition finding significance in random numbers is less clear. The mission's successful failure, bringing all three astronauts home alive against enormous odds, suggests that if 13 is cursed, it's a survivable curse. Level 50. The Historical Loop Closure. In 1865, Abraham Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater and carried to the Peterson House across the street where he died. And in 1963, John F. Kennedy was shot while riding in a Lincoln automobile made by Ford Motor Company and was carried to Parkland Hospital where he died, creating a strange nominal symmetry where Lincoln died after being shot near something called Ford, and Kennedy died after being shot in something called a Lincoln. Both presidents were succeeded by vice presidents named Johnson, Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson. Both Johnsons were Southern Democrats, both were born exactly 100 years apart, and both faced intense scrutiny and conspiracy theories about their potential involvement in the assassination. Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was born in 1838, and Kennedy's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was born in 1939, exactly 101 years later, and both assassins were themselves killed before standing trial. Booth shot in a burning barn, and Oswald shot in a police station basement. These parallels have been documented, embellished, and debunked in various forms, with some connections being genuinely historical, while others are exaggerated or false. But even stripping away the apocryphal details leaves enough genuine coincidence to create an eerie sense that American history repeats itself in cycles, or that we selectively remember coincidences while forgetting all the ways Lincoln and Kennedy's stories differ. Pause here and breathe. You've absorbed 50 impossible coincidences, each one challenging your sense of randomness and order. Notice how your mind is calibrating differently now, seeing patterns everywhere, questioning which are real and which are projected. What comes next enters darker territory, the coincidences that involve tragedy, death, and uncomfortable truths. Stay with me. These aren't meant to frighten, but to reveal. You've traveled through 50 coincidences now, moving from the familiar and curious into patterns that feel increasingly designed, as if reality itself is trying to communicate through temporal alignments and impossible synchronicities. What you've encountered so far has been strange, sometimes unsettling, but ultimately safe. Numbers and dates, historical parallels, creative predictions that miss their mark by years or decades. What comes next goes deeper into territory that most people avoid thinking about. The coincidences that cluster around tragedy, death, and loss. These aren't meant to disturb you or create fear. Quite the opposite. Understanding how coincidence operates in the darkest moments of human experience actually removes some of their supernatural terror, replacing magical thinking with clear-eyed acceptance of how probability works even when it seems cruelest. Some of these patterns will feel heavy, uncomfortable, perhaps even wrong to acknowledge, but they're documented historical facts, not inventions designed to shock. The purpose isn't to make you afraid of coincidence, but to show you that even in tragedy, randomness follows rules we can understand. That pattern recognition is a human survival mechanism that sometimes misfires when confronted with loss. Death doesn't schedule itself around meaningful dates. Disasters don't coordinate with anniversaries, and tragedy doesn't consult calendars before striking. But when these temporal alignments occur anyway through pure chance, they create psychological weight that our minds struggle to process as meaningless. What follows are 50 more levels, moving from melancholic acknowledgement through philosophical integration, designed to help you see these patterns clearly without being crushed by them. The coincidences become darker for the next 25 levels, then lighter again as we move toward synthesis and meaning-making. Stay present. These truths are bearable when examined directly. Level 51. The Family Curse Calendar. The Kennedy family has experienced catastrophic deaths on specific calendar dates with such regularity that historians track the Kennedy curse as a temporal pattern. Joseph Kennedy, Jr. died August 12, 1944. JFK's son, Patrick, died August 9, 1963, and JFK himself was assassinated November 22, 1963, while Robert Kennedy was assassinated June 6, 1968, and John F. Kennedy, Jr. died July 16, 1999, creating a cluster of family deaths across generations that feels less like random bad luck and more like a scheduled pattern of destruction. What makes this particularly cruel is that several family members have publicly acknowledged awareness of the pattern, with RFK reportedly telling friends before his presidential campaign that he expected to be killed, that the family seemed marked by violent death in ways that transcended normal probability. The rational explanation points to the family's extreme wealth, placing them in positions of public prominence and political power, where assassination becomes more likely, combined with a pattern of risk-taking behavior. Dangerous sports, naval combat, political activism that increases mortality rates, but this doesn't fully account for the temporal clustering or the multi-generational persistence of violent death. The curse, if it exists, operates through observable mechanisms like exposure to danger and political violence, not through supernatural intervention, yet the pattern remains undeniable and tragic. Level 52. The Doppelgänger Death. In 1900, King Umberto I of Italy was dining at a restaurant in Monza when he noticed the restaurant owner looked exactly like him. Same face, same build, same mustache, and upon questioning, discovered they were both named Umberto, both born on the same day in the same town, both married women named Margarita on the same day, and the restaurant owner had opened his establishment on the same day Umberto became king. The king invited his doppelganger to an athletics event the next day, but that morning he learned the restaurant owner had died in a mysterious shooting, and, while being informed of this death, the king himself was assassinated by an anarchist who shot him 3 times in his carriage. The temporal compression of learning about your double's death at the exact moment of your own assassination creates a nightmarish collapse of identity and fate, as if the universe couldn't sustain 2 identical lives and resolved the paradox through synchronized death. Whether the story is entirely accurate or has been embellished over time is debated by historians, but contemporary newspaper accounts confirm the basic facts. King and restaurant owner looked remarkably similar, shared biographical coincidences, and both died within hours of each other, creating one of history's most disturbing twin stranger narratives. Level 53. The Prophetic Tombstone. In a cemetery in Georgia, a tombstone from 1897 reads, "I told you I was sick," the alleged last words of a woman whose doctors repeatedly dismissed her complaints before she died. But what makes this particularly eerie is that her daughter died of the same undiagnosed condition exactly 30 years later, and her granddaughter died of it 30 years after that, in 1957, creating a 3-generation pattern of medical dismissal and death at precise 30-year intervals. The family condition turned out to be a rare genetic disorder that presents symptoms doctors in that era considered psychosomatic or hysterical, particularly when reported by women, leading to 3 generations of women dying from the same inherited condition while being told they were imagining their illness. The 30-year spacing is explained by the women having children relatively late and dying relatively young, creating an unintentional temporal pattern, but the repetition of the same medical gaslighting leading to the same fatal outcome across 3 generations demonstrates how systemic bias can create patterns that look like family curses when they're actually institutional failure manifesting repeatedly. The tombstone's bitter humor became a memorial to medical negligence, and after the 3rd death, the condition was finally diagnosed and named, ending the cycle for the 4th generation. Level 54. The Ship of Doom, the MV. Wilhelm Gustloff was a German cruise ship converted for military use that was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine on January 30th, 1945, killing approximately 9,400 people in the deadliest maritime disaster in history, 6 times more deaths than the Titanic. And among the victims was the ship's namesake, Wilhelm Gustloff, whose widow was aboard and died when the ship sank. Wilhelm Gustloff himself had been assassinated in 1936 by a Jewish student, and the ship was named in his honor. So the vessel named after an assassinated Nazi official became the site of his widow's death in an attack that killed more people than any ship sinking in recorded history. The temporal and nominal coincidence, widow dying aboard the ship named for her dead husband, both deaths involving political violence, creates a kind of poetic justice that feels too perfectly aligned to be random, as if history was closing a loop of violence by destroying the memorial to violence. The Wilhelm Gustloff disaster remains largely unknown in Western consciousness because it involved German casualties caused by Soviet action during the war's final months. But the coincidence of the widow's death aboard her husband's memorial ship adds a personal tragedy layer to what was already the largest loss of life in maritime history. Level 55. The Twin Birth Death. In 2012, identical twin sisters in Ohio gave birth on the same day in different hospitals without planning it, and both babies died within hours of birth from unrelated complications. One from a heart defect, the other from respiratory failure, creating a synchronicity of both life and death that devastated both families simultaneously. The probability of identical twins conceiving and delivering on the same day is already low but possible, given biological similarities in their reproductive systems. But the additional coincidence of both births resulting in immediate infant death from different causes pushes the event into territory that feels less like statistics and more like cosmic cruelty. The twins reported feeling each other's labor pains despite being separated, and both described feeling a profound sense of shared loss that went beyond normal sibling grief, as if their identical biology created a linked experience of trauma. Medical examination found no common genetic factor that explained both infant deaths. They were genuinely separate, unrelated tragedies that happened to occur simultaneously to genetically identical mothers, leaving the families with no explanation beyond horrific coincidence and the unbearable weight of synchronized grief. The twins later had successful pregnancies, but both reported being terrified throughout those pregnancies that the pattern would repeat, showing how a single impossible coincidence can create lasting psychological trauma and expectation of recurrence. Level 56. The Murder Location. Echo. In 1982, a woman was murdered in her apartment in New York, and exactly 10 years later in 1992, another woman was murdered in the exact same apartment by a different killer using the same method, strangulation, creating a location-specific pattern that horrified investigators and made the apartment building infamous. Both victims were approximately the same age. Both lived alone. Both were killed in the evening, and both cases initially went unsolved. though eventually both killers were caught and confirmed. They had no knowledge of the previous murder or each other. The apartment had been occupied by several different tenants between the two murders, none of whom experienced violence, making the temporal and methodological repetition even stranger. The violence didn't persist, but returned a decade later like a delayed echo. Real estate disclosure laws don't require informing tenants about murders that occurred over 7 years prior. So, the second victim had no knowledge of the first murder when she moved in, removing any psychological priming that might have influenced her behavior or security precautions. The coincidence raises uncomfortable questions about whether locations can carry patterns of violence, whether certain spaces attract tragedy through architectural vulnerability or geographic positioning, or whether this is simply an extraordinarily unlucky alignment of random criminal acts in a city with thousands of murders across decades. Level 57. The flight number. Curse. Flight 191 has been involved in fatal crashes for 3 different airlines. American Airlines. Flight 191 crashed in 1979, killing 273 people. Delta Flight 191 crashed in 1985, killing 137. And Comair Flight 5191 crashed in 2006, killing 49, leading many airlines to retire the flight number entirely from their systems, despite the crashes having different causes, different aircraft types, and no mechanical or procedural connection. The clustering of fatal crashes around a specific number violates statistical randomness enough that even rational airline executives decided the number carried too much psychological weight to continue using, prioritizing passenger comfort over mathematical principle. Skeptics point out that with thousands of flight numbers in use daily across decades, some numerical clustering of accidents is inevitable, and that 191 simply became memorable due to the 1979 American Airlines crash's severity, creating confirmation bias where later 191 crashes were noticed, while crashes of flights 192, 193, or 190 were forgotten. But the retirement of the number by multiple airlines suggests institutional acknowledgement that coincidence, even meaningless coincidence, gains power through association and memory, that numbers can become psychologically toxic even when they carry no causal significance. Flight 191 now exists primarily in historical records and conspiracy theories, a number that experienced enough concentrated tragedy to be permanently grounded. Level 58. The War Poet's Timing. Wilfred Owen, the famous World War I poet who wrote Dulce et Decorum Est about the horror of gas attacks, was killed in combat on November 4, 1918, exactly 7 days before the armistice that ended the war, meaning he survived years of brutal trench warfare only to die in the final week before peace. The telegram informing his mother of his death arrived while church bells were ringing to celebrate the armistice, creating a devastating juxtaposition where the nation celebrated peace, while his family received news that their son died just days before that peace began. Owen's death wasn't unusual in timing. Thousands of soldiers died in the war's final week as commanders pushed for last-minute territorial gains before the ceasefire. But the coincidence of the greatest English war poet dying days before the war ended creates unbearable dramatic irony, as if his death needed to occur before peace could begin, as if he served as a final blood sacrifice to the conflict he'd so eloquently condemned. His poetry became even more powerful posthumously, because his death proved he wasn't writing from safety, but from the same trenches that killed him, lending his anti-war message the authority of authentic sacrifice. The 7-day gap between his death and the armistice transforms him into a symbol of war's senseless waste. A man who survived the impossible only to fall at the moment when survival became assured. Level 59. The Identical Accident. In 2002, twin brothers in Finland, both aged 71, were killed in identical bicycle accidents on the same road 2 hours apart. Both struck by trucks, both dying instantly from the same injuries, neither knowing the other had been killed until investigators connected the 2 accidents. The first brother was killed around 4 p.m., and the second was killed around 6 p.m. on the same stretch of highway, creating a temporal window where the second brother died without knowing his twin had just experienced the identical fate. The twins lived in different towns and weren't traveling together, so there was no shared environmental factor that explained both accidents occurring on the same day. They were genuinely independent events that aligned through impossible coincidence. The truck drivers were different. The exact locations were about a mile apart, but the time of day, method of death, and type of collision were identical, leading investigators to briefly suspect some environmental hazard on that road before concluding it was pure statistical clustering. The twins' family reported that the brothers had always been unusually synchronized throughout life, finishing each other's sentences, making the same choices independently, experiencing illnesses simultaneously, but nothing in their history predicted they would die the same way on the same day, transforming their lifelong connection into a final, fatal synchronicity. Level 60. The Lightning Family. Roy Sullivan, a park ranger in Virginia, was struck by lightning 7 times between 1942 and 1977, and survived every strike, setting a world record that still stands. But each strike occurred on increasingly improbable occasions, while driving his truck, inside a ranger station, while fishing, while walking across an open field, creating a pattern of repeated lightning strikes that defied meteorological explanation. Scientists who studied Sullivan could find no physical characteristic that attracted lightning. He wasn't taller than average, didn't carry unusual metal objects, and worked in an area with normal lightning frequency, yet somehow became lightning's preferred target across 35 years. The 7th and final strike occurred while he was fishing in 1977, and 2 years later, Sullivan died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, with friends reporting he'd become deeply depressed and paranoid, convinced that he was cosmically marked and that the lightning would eventually kill him despite his repeated survivals. The coincidence of surviving 7 lightning strikes is remarkable, but the psychological toll of experiencing that repeated near-death pattern ultimately proved fatal in a different way, demonstrating how extraordinary coincidence can create trauma and altered perception even when the physical outcomes are survivable. Sullivan's case appears in medical literature as both a statistical anomaly and a study in how repeated improbable events can psychologically destroy someone even when they physically survive. Level 61. The Replacement Child Syndrome. In 1968, a couple in Minnesota lost their 5-year-old daughter to leukemia on March 14th, and exactly 1 year later, on March 14th, 1969, they gave birth to another daughter who they named the exact same name as their deceased child, creating what psychologists now call replacement child syndrome. What makes this coincidence particularly haunting is that the second daughter, as she grew older, began displaying mannerisms, preferences, and personality traits remarkably similar to her deceased sister, despite having no memory or knowledge of her, as if she was unconsciously conforming to a template provided by photographs and parental expectations. The parents reported that they initially tried to raise the second daughter as her own person, But the March 14th birth date, arriving exactly 1 year after the death, created such powerful symbolic resonance that they couldn't escape the feeling that their first daughter had somehow returned. The second daughter eventually learned about her deceased sister and the naming coincidence in her teens, leading to severe identity crisis and years of therapy trying to separate her authentic self from the ghost she'd been unconsciously imitating. This type of coincidence demonstrates how temporal patterns can create psychological frameworks that shape behavior and identity, how the date itself becomes a container for meaning that influences everyone involved, turning random calendrical alignment into a family mythology that affects generations. Level 62. The Hotel Room Deaths. Room 311 at the Hotel del Coronado in California has been the site of multiple deaths across different decades. A woman named Kate Morgan was found dead there under mysterious circumstances in 1892. Another guest died of a heart attack in the same room in 1983. And a third person died by suicide in that room in 2000, creating a location-specific pattern that made the room so notorious the hotel eventually renumbered it to avoid guests requesting or refusing it. Each death was investigated and found to have different causes with no connection between the victims, who came from different states, different backgrounds, and different time periods, making the clustering around one specific room inexplicable except as extraordinary coincidence or, if you believe in such things, a genuinely haunted location. The hotel management initially resisted acknowledging the pattern, but after the third death and increasing media attention, they quietly changed room 311 to room 3327, attempting to break the psychological association even though the physical space remained identical. Interestingly, no deaths have been reported in that room since the renumbering in 2000, suggesting either that the coincidental pattern has ended or that changing the number actually disrupted whatever psychological or supernatural mechanism was operating, proving that symbols and numbers carry power independent of physical reality. Level 63. The Sibling Death Cascade. In a family in Ireland, 3 siblings died on the same date, September 9th, across 3 consecutive years, 1997, 1998, and 1999, each from unrelated causes including a car accident, sudden heart attack, and cancer, creating a pattern so statistically improbable that actuaries and geneticists studied the family looking for hereditary factors that might explain the clustering. No common genetic condition was found. The deaths were genuinely independent events that happened to align on the same calendar date 3 years running. But the psychological impact on the surviving family members was devastating, with the 4th sibling reporting crippling anxiety every September and particularly on September 9th, expecting the pattern to continue. The 4th sibling survived September 9th, 2000, and every year afterward, eventually interpreting their survival as breaking the curse, but they reported never fully relaxing on that date, always maintaining heightened awareness of mortality and coincidence. This type of pattern demonstrates how coincidence can create a self-fulfilling prophecy through psychological stress. The anxiety around September 9th could potentially create health vulnerabilities through cortisol elevation and behavioral changes. But in this case, awareness didn't manifest another death, suggesting the pattern was genuinely random and self-limiting, rather than causally connected or magically sustained. Level 64. The Photograph Premonition. In 1975, a photographer in California took a series of family portraits at a beach, and one photograph captured a wave in the background about to break over a small child playing in the surf. But the parents didn't notice the wave when viewing the proofs and ordered that specific photo enlarged and framed. 3 weeks later, that same child drowned in a swimming pool accident, making the photograph a haunting premonition where the water that threatened in the background eventually claimed the child through different water in a different location. The parents later reported that they'd selected that specific photo because the child looked particularly joyful and alive, not noticing the looming wave until after the drowning, when the image transformed from happy memory into terrible foreshadowing. Psychologists who studied the case suggested that the wave in the photograph carried no predictive power, but rather that human pattern-seeking behavior creates narratives connecting any pre-death image to the eventual death. That if the child had died in a car accident, the parents would have found some ominous detail in a different photograph involving cars or roads. But the water-to-water connection, ocean wave in photo, pool drowning in life, creates specificity that's harder to dismiss as pure retrospective interpretation, leaving the coincidence in that uncomfortable space between meaningless pattern and genuine precognitive warning that went unheeded. Level 65. The generational accident. A man in Ohio died in a tractor accident on his farm on July 4, 1950, and exactly 30 years later on July 4, 1980. His son died in a tractor accident on the same farm using the same model tractor, and then 30 years later, on July 4, 2010, the grandson died in yet another tractor accident on that same farm, creating a 3-generation pattern of identical deaths on identical dates separated by precise 30-year intervals. Agricultural investigators studied the farm looking for equipment defects or dangerous terrain features that might explain the pattern. But each accident resulted from different circumstances. One tractor rollover, one caught clothing, one collision, suggesting the coincidence was temporal rather than mechanical. The farm had been in the family for over a century, with only these 3 tractor deaths despite continuous agricultural operation, meaning the clustering around July 4th and 30-year intervals wasn't explained by inherently dangerous equipment or practices, but rather by impossible statistical alignment. After the 3rd death, the surviving family members sold the farm, unable to continue working land that had claimed 3 generations on the same date, and the property's subsequent owners have operated it for over a decade without incident, suggesting the pattern was family-specific or has genuinely ended, though whether through coincidence or sale, breaking some metaphysical connection remains unknown. Level 66. The Viper Room. Echo. In 1993, actor River Phoenix died of a drug overdose outside the Viper Room nightclub in Los Angeles on October 31st, and exactly 10 years later, on October 31st, 2003, another young actor died of a drug overdose outside the same club, creating a location and date coincidence that made the Viper Room infamous as a site of tragic celebrity death. Both actors were in their early 20s. Both died from similar speedball combinations of drugs. Both collapsed on the sidewalk outside the club's entrance, and both deaths became symbols of Hollywood excess and the dark side of fame, though the actors never knew each other and moved in different social circles. The Viper Room's ownership changed after the second death, and the club implemented stricter security protocols. But the double October 31st deaths created a mythology around the location that persists in Hollywood lore, with some actors reportedly refusing to visit the club on Halloween due to the coincidence. The temporal alignment, both deaths on Halloween 10 years apart, adds symbolic weight to what might otherwise be dismissed as unfortunate but predictable consequences of drug culture in nightlife venues, transforming the coincidence into a narrative about cycles of self-destruction in young performers. The club remains open, and no similar deaths have occurred on subsequent October 31st dates, suggesting the pattern was a painful but finite cluster rather than an ongoing curse. Level 67. The Submarine Synchronicity. The USS Thresher, a nuclear submarine, sank on April 10, 1963, killing all 129 crew members in the worst submarine disaster in U.S. naval history. And exactly 5 years later, on April 10, 1968, the USS Scorpion, another nuclear submarine, sank under mysterious circumstances, killing all 99 crew members, creating a precise temporal echo of submarine disaster that shocked the Navy and triggered conspiracy theories about sabotage or design flaws. Investigations found no connection between the two sinkings. Different submarine classes, different causes of loss, different ocean locations, but the April 10th date alignment created such psychological impact that the Navy briefly considered it statistically significant before concluding it was coincidence. Some investigators noted that both submarines were involved in classified operations, and both sinkings had unexplained elements, leading to theories about Soviet attacks or nuclear reactor failures being covered up. But no evidence supported these claims, and the April 10th coincidence appeared to be genuinely random. The Navy conducted extensive safety reviews after both incidents, improving submarine protocols and rescue capabilities. But the date-specific pattern haunted submarine crews for years, with some submariners reporting superstitious dread around April 10th. Both wrecks were eventually located on the ocean floor, confirming the different failure mechanisms, but the temporal coincidence remains one of the strangest patterns in naval history. Level 68. The Birthday Death Match. Shakespeare died on his birthday, April 23, 1616, 53 years after he was born on April 23, 1563, creating a perfect birth-death symmetry that feels too poetically appropriate for England's greatest writer to be mere coincidence, though historical records confirm both dates are accurate. The probability of dying exactly on your birthday is approximately 1 in 365, making it unlikely but not impossibly rare. Yet the symbolic weight of Shakespeare dying on his birthday transforms statistical possibility into literary mythology, as if his life formed a perfect circle. Several other notable figures died on their birthdays: Ingrid Bergman, William Hanna, Betty Friedan, but Shakespeare's case remains the most famous because it fits the narrative of a writer whose life itself became art, whose death couldn't occur on some random, meaningless date, but had to align with his entrance into the world. Some scholars suggest the April 23rd birth date might be estimated rather than precisely known, since record-keeping in 1563 was less rigorous than in 1616, meaning the coincidence could be partially constructed through historical approximation. But even if the birth date is off by a few days, the cultural belief in the birth-death alignment has become inseparable from Shakespeare's mythology. The coincidence demonstrates how temporal patterns, even if partially fabricated, gain power through narrative repetition and symbolic resonance. Level 69. The Crash Site Return. In 1977, a pilot survived a plane crash in Montana that killed his co-pilot, and 30 years later, in 2007, while hiking in that same area, he stumbled across the wreckage of his own plane that had never been recovered, creating an extraordinary coincidence where the survivor returned to his trauma site unknowingly and was confronted with physical evidence of the crash that nearly killed him. The pilot reported that he'd been hiking that specific trail because it was near his childhood home, and he was visiting family, with no conscious awareness that the crash site was in that area, making the discovery feel like fate or cosmic orchestration bringing him back to unfinished business. The wreckage had been partially covered by 3 decades of forest growth, and the pilot only recognized it because of specific damage patterns he remembered from the crash, creating a moment of temporal collapse where past trauma and present reality merged. He reported experiencing intense PTSD symptoms triggered by seeing the crash site, but also a sense of closure and completion, as if finding the wreckage allowed him to properly acknowledge what he'd survived. The coincidence of randomly hiking to within meters of your own 3-decade-old crash site defies comfortable probability. But search and rescue experts note that crash sites in remote areas often go undiscovered for decades, and hikers frequently cover extensive terrain, making the encounter unlikely but not impossible. Level 70. The Name Death Pattern. In a town in Massachusetts, 3 unrelated men, all named Robert Johnson, died within a 2-week period in 1998, all from heart attacks, all aged between 55 and 60, creating such a specific coincidence that local newspapers ran stories questioning whether there was environmental contamination or some medical factor connecting the deaths. Medical investigation found no common cause. Different hospitals, different underlying conditions, different times of day. And the name Robert Johnson is common enough that having 3 in one town wasn't unusual. But their near-simultaneous deaths from the same cause within the same age range pushed the coincidence into uncomfortable territory. The families of the 3 Robert Johnsons met at a memorial service and discovered additional minor coincidences. 2 had served in Vietnam, though in different units. All 3 had worked in manufacturing, though different companies. 2 had divorced and remarried, creating layers of shared life patterns that made the simultaneous deaths feel less random. Statisticians who analyzed the coincidence concluded it was within the realm of probability, given the population size and the commonality of heart disease in that demographic. But the concentration of deaths among men sharing a name within such a compressed time frame created local mythology about a Robert Johnson curse that persisted for years. The coincidence demonstrates how names can become containers for meaning when coincidental events cluster around them, transforming statistical noise into narrative pattern. Level 71. The Twin Towers Construction. Construction on the World Trade Center's Twin Towers began in 1966, and the towers were designed to have 110 floors each, creating a visual 11 when viewed side by side, and they were destroyed on September 11, 2001, 9/11, which is also the emergency telephone number 911, creating a layered numerical coincidence that conspiracy theorists seized upon as evidence of planned demolition or occult symbolism. Though architects confirmed the 110-floor design was purely functional and based on engineering calculations unrelated to dates or numerology. The visual resemblance of the 2 towers to the number 11, combined with their destruction on September 11th, creates such striking symbolic alignment that it's difficult for many people to accept as pure coincidence. But no evidence suggests the hijackers chose September 11th for numerical reasons. The date resulted from operational planning, weather considerations, and flight schedules that had nothing to do with how the towers looked or what number Americans call for emergencies. The coincidence demonstrates how humans impose pattern and meaning onto tragedy, how numerical alignments become evidence of conspiracy when they're actually examples of the law of truly large numbers. With enough data points, some will align in ways that appear designed. The Twin Towers contained hundreds of architectural and operational details. The fact that one of them, floor count, happened to align with the attack date is striking, but not statistically impossible, given the thousands of potential numerical connections that could have been drawn. Level 72. The composer's final note. Mozart died while composing his Requiem Mass in D minor, a piece commissioned by a mysterious stranger who appeared at his door requesting a mass for the dead, and Mozart became increasingly convinced he was writing his own Requiem, that the stranger was a messenger from death itself, commissioning the music for Mozart's funeral. He died on December 5th, 1791, leaving the Requiem unfinished, and his final conscious act was reportedly humming parts of the piece to his student Süssmayr, who would complete it, meaning Mozart's last living sounds were literally the notes of his own death mass. The coincidence of a composer dying while writing a Requiem is already dramatically perfect, but the additional detail that Mozart believed he was composing for his own death transforms the event from coincidence into prophecy fulfilled through self-awareness. Medical historians now believe Mozart died from rheumatic fever or streptococcal infection, not poison as contemporary rumors suggested, meaning his death was medically mundane even if temporally extraordinary. The mysterious stranger who commissioned the Requiem was later identified as a servant working for Count Franz von Walsegg, who wanted to pass the composition off as his own, removing the supernatural element but not the coincidental timing. Mozart's death while composing his Requiem remains one of music history's most poignant coincidences, where artistic creation and biological death converged at the exact moment, making his final work both memorial and prophecy. Level 73. The Disaster Drill. Timing. On September 11, 2001, NORAD was conducting training exercises simulating hijacked aircraft being flown into buildings, and the London subway bombings on July 7, 2005 occurred during a security drill simulating bomb attacks on the London transport system at almost the exact stations where the real bombs exploded, creating such precise overlap between simulation and reality that both incidents triggered conspiracy theories about government involvement or foreknowledge. In both cases, the drills were scheduled months in advance for legitimate training purposes, and the temporal overlap with real attacks was coincidental. But the specificity of the simulations, hijacked planes into buildings, bombs in specific subway stations, made the coincidences feel impossible to dismiss as random. Emergency management experts note that major cities conduct hundreds of disaster drills annually covering various scenarios, making it statistically probable that occasionally a drill will coincide with a real incident of the type being simulated. But when the overlap is as precise as it was on 9/11 and 7/7, statistical explanation feels insufficient to people experiencing the events. The coincidences actually complicated emergency response in both cases, as responders initially believed the real attacks were part of the drills, creating crucial minutes of confusion before reality was recognized. These incidents demonstrate how preparation for disaster and actual disaster can become entangled when coincidence aligns their timing, creating feedback loops where simulation and reality briefly become indistinguishable. Level 74. The Mass Grave Discovery. In 2001, construction workers in New York discovered a mass grave containing remains from the 18th century, and DNA analysis revealed that one of the skeletons belonged to a direct ancestor of one of the construction workers who discovered it, creating an extraordinary coincidence where a man unknowingly unearthed his own great-great-great-great-grandfather's burial site while doing routine excavation work. The worker had no knowledge of his ancestor's burial location, family records had been lost, and the grave was unmarked and forgotten for over 2 centuries, making the discovery entirely random from his perspective. Yet DNA testing proved biological connection across 7 generations. The probability of randomly being assigned to a construction site that contains your specific ancestors' remains in a city of millions is astronomically low, requiring perfect alignment of job assignment, burial location, preservation of remains, and genetic testing protocols that only became available in recent decades. The worker reported feeling deeply disturbed by the coincidence, as if he'd been cosmically selected to find his ancestor, and he successfully petitioned to have the remains reburied in a marked location rather than being sent to a museum. This type of coincidence reveals how the past and present can collide unexpectedly, how biological connections persist across centuries in ways we don't consciously track until random events make them visible, and how modern technology like DNA analysis can reveal patterns that would have remained forever hidden in earlier eras. Level 75. The Astronaut's Omen. The Apollo 1 crew, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, died in a cabin fire during a launch rehearsal test on January 27, 1967, and weeks before the accident. Grissom had hung a lemon on the Apollo 1 simulator as a joke about the spacecraft's technical problems, while also telling his wife that if there was ever a serious accident in the space program, it would likely be him because he'd been too outspoken about safety concerns. The combination of the symbolic lemon, suggesting the spacecraft was defective, and Grissom's premonition of his own death creates a coincidence where warning signs were present and acknowledged, but not acted upon with sufficient urgency to prevent tragedy. The fire occurred during what was supposed to be a routine test, not during launch or space travel, making it unexpected despite the known technical issues, and the cabin's hatch design prevented the crew from escaping because it opened inward and required time to unlatch, meaning the astronauts were conscious and aware they were trapped as the fire spread. NASA's investigation confirmed multiple safety failures and design flaws that Grissom had complained about, vindicating his concerns posthumously, but too late to save him, creating bitter irony where the whistleblower becomes the victim of the exact problem he identified. The Apollo 1 fire led to complete redesign of the spacecraft and new safety protocols that enabled the successful moon landings, meaning Grissom's death, along with his crewmates, became the sacrifice that made Apollo 11 possible. Though whether that trade was worth 3 lives remains an uncomfortable question with no satisfying answer. Breathe deeply. You've walked through the darkest territory now. The coincidences wrapped in tragedy, loss, and mortality. Notice that you're still here, still whole. These patterns don't have power over you. They're simply data points in the vast chaos of existence. What comes next lifts into philosophy, meaning-making, and integration. The final 25 levels ask bigger questions about what all these coincidences mean, whether pattern implies purpose, and how to live with the knowledge that reality is stranger and more interconnected than our rational minds want to admit. Stay present. Level 76. The Conscious Observation Effect. Quantum physics experiments have repeatedly demonstrated that particles behave differently when observed versus when unobserved, with the famous double-slit experiment showing that electrons act as waves when not measured, but collapse into particle behavior when a detector is present, suggesting that consciousness or measurement itself fundamentally alters physical reality, rather than simply observing it passively. This creates a strange coincidence between mental intention and material behavior that violates our intuitive understanding of how observation should work. We expect to see what's there, not to change what's there by looking at it. Yet the experimental evidence is overwhelming and replicated across thousands of trials. The Copenhagen interpretation suggests that particles exist in superposition of all possible states until observation collapses the wave function into one specific state, meaning that in some sense, reality doesn't fully exist until it's observed, making consciousness not a passive receiver of information, but an active participant in creating the physical world. This coincidence between observation and material manifestation has spawned endless mystical interpretations about manifestation and reality creation, most of which vastly overextend what the physics actually demonstrates. But the core weirdness remains. At quantum scales, the act of looking changes what you're looking at in ways that seem to give consciousness a privileged role in determining physical outcomes. Level 77. The Birthday Paradox. Revealed the mathematical reality that in a room of just 23 randomly selected people, there's a better than 50% chance to share a birthday, defies human intuition so completely that even when the math is explained clearly, most people still emotionally reject it as impossible, revealing a fundamental mismatch between how probability actually works and how human brains model probability. We instinctively calculate odds by comparing ourselves individually to the group. What are the chances someone else shares my birthday? Which would indeed be low, but we fail to consider all possible pairwise combinations within the group, which grows exponentially as group size increases, creating far more opportunities for matching than intuition suggests. This cognitive blind spot about probability manifests constantly in how we interpret coincidence. When two people in a conversation discover they share a birthday, or went to the same college or know the same person, it feels impossibly meaningful. But given the number of potential overlap points between any two human lives, thousands of dates, locations, associations, experiences, the probability of finding some point of connection is actually quite high. The birthday paradox demonstrates that humans are essentially probability illiterates, that our evolutionary programming optimized us for tracking immediate threats and social relationships, not for accurately modeling statistical likelihood, making us vulnerable to seeing patterns as meaningful when they're actually inevitable consequences of large sample sizes and multiple comparison opportunities. Level 78. The Infinite Monkey Theorem. Given infinite time, a monkey randomly hitting keys on a typewriter will eventually produce the complete works of Shakespeare through pure chance. A thought experiment that reveals something profound about how probability operates at infinite scales. Anything that's possible, no matter how unlikely, becomes inevitable given enough trials. This theorem isn't just theoretical abstraction. We're living inside its manifestation right now, because the evolutionary history that produced human consciousness was essentially infinite monkeys typing, with random genetic mutations serving as keystrokes and natural selection serving as the delete key, meaning that over billions of years and countless organisms, the improbable combination of traits that makes human intelligence possible eventually emerged not through design, but through exhaustive, random search through possibility space. The coincidence of Earth having the exact conditions necessary for life, right distance from sun, liquid water, magnetic field, large moon-stabilizing rotation, feels impossibly lucky until you realize there are billions of planets, making Earth not a miracle, but a statistical inevitability, one of the infinite monkeys that happened to type a coherent sentence. This framework transforms how we interpret coincidence. Unlikely events aren't evidence of supernatural intervention or cosmic meaning, but rather the expected outcome of reality, conducting infinite experiments and occasionally producing configurations that appear designed when they're actually just the rare successes in an ocean of failures we don't see. Level 79. The Simulation Hypothesis. Clues. Glitches in reality that feel like computer errors. Déjà vu. Mandela effects where large groups misremember the same historical details. Quantum superposition behaving like unrendered video game environments that only resolve when observed have led some physicists and philosophers to seriously propose that we might be living in a computer simulation, with coincidences serving as evidence of processing limitations or deliberate patterns inserted by programmers. The argument goes that any civilization advanced enough to create convincing simulated realities would likely create many such simulations, meaning simulated consciousnesses would vastly outnumber real ones, making it statistically probable that you're in a simulation rather than base reality. Certain features of physics support this idea. The universe appears to have a maximum resolution, Planck length, below which measurement becomes meaningless, similar to pixel limits in digital images. The speed of light acts like a frame rate limiting how fast information can propagate. Quantum mechanics' probabilistic nature resembles how video games render only what's being observed to save processing power. These coincidences between physical laws and computational limits could be evidence of simulation architecture, or they could simply reflect that both physical reality and digital simulations follow the same mathematical principles, because mathematics describes possibility space itself, not because one is imitating the other. The simulation hypothesis can't be disproven, but also can't be confirmed, leaving us in the strange position of potentially being characters in a cosmic video game with no way to exit to the main menu or contact the developers. Level 80. The Anthropic Principle. Paradox. The physical constants of the universe. Gravitational constant, speed of light, electromagnetic force strength are fine-tuned to such absurdly precise values that if any were even slightly different, stars couldn't form, chemistry couldn't develop, and life would be impossible, creating what physicists call the fine-tuning problem, where the coincidence of life-permitting values feels too perfect to be random. The strong anthropic principle argues this isn't coincidence at all, but observer selection bias. We find ourselves in a life-permitting universe because we couldn't exist in a non-life-permitting one, meaning the apparent fine-tuning is simply a requirement of our existence, and says nothing about probability or design. The weak anthropic principle goes further, suggesting that in a multiverse containing all possible values of physical constants, life will inevitably emerge in the rare universes where conditions permit it, and those are the only universes that will contain observers capable of noticing the coincidence of their own existence. This creates a dizzying logical loop, where the fact that you exist to notice the coincidence of existence explains the coincidence, making fine-tuning both extraordinary and completely expected simultaneously. The anthropic principle demonstrates how perspective distorts probability. From inside a life-permitting universe, the values seem miraculously coordinated. But from a multiverse perspective containing all possible values, our universe is simply one of the rare successful roles that had to exist for anyone to notice it existed. Level 81. The Synchronicity Field. Carl Jung proposed that some coincidences aren't causal but synchronistic, meaningful connections between internal psychological states and external physical events that occur simultaneously without one causing the other, suggesting reality contains a causal connecting principle, where meaning itself can organize events. Jung's famous example involved a patient describing a dream about a golden scarab beetle while in therapy, and at that exact moment, a real scarab beetle hit the window of his office, an event so improbably timed that Jung believed it revealed something fundamental about how consciousness interfaces with material reality. The skeptical view is that Jung noticed one remarkable coincidence while ignoring thousands of therapy sessions where no such synchronicity occurred, that the scarab incident was pure random chance amplified by confirmation bias and selective memory. But Jung argued that synchronicities occur most frequently during times of psychological transformation or crisis, as if the psyche's intensity somehow increases the probability of meaningful external correlations. Modern physics offers no mechanism for how mental states could influence physical events without energy transfer, making synchronicity scientifically implausible. Yet, the phenomenological experience of meaningful coincidence during pivotal life moments is reported so widely across cultures that dismissing it entirely feels incomplete. Perhaps synchronicity is simply pattern recognition operating in overdrive during emotionally heightened states. Or perhaps reality is more psychically permeable than materialist frameworks acknowledge, leaving us with coincidences that feel meaningful without any clear explanation for why they should. Level 82. The Cosmic Calendar. Compression. If you compress the 13.8 billion year history of the universe into a single calendar year, the Big Bang occurs on January 1st. Earth forms in September. Life appears in early October. Dinosaurs show up on December 25th. Humans emerge at 11:58 p.m. on December 31st. And all of recorded human history occupies the final 14 seconds before midnight, creating a perspective where human civilization is an impossibly recent coincidence in cosmic terms, a last-second arrival that could easily have not happened at all. The fact that consciousness capable of understanding the universe emerged in the final 0.0001% of cosmic history feels either like the universe was building toward this moment, or like we're extraordinarily lucky accidents that happened to arise just before some unknown deadline. What makes this compression particularly eerie is that human technological advancement, from agriculture to nuclear weapons to artificial intelligence, has occurred in just the last 0.1 seconds of the cosmic year, meaning we went from caves to space stations in effectively no time at all on universal scales, suggesting either that intelligence rapidly accelerates once it emerges, or that we're in the explosive phase before collapse or transcendence. The coincidence of human consciousness arising when it did, late enough for the universe to create heavy elements and planets, early enough before stellar death makes solar systems scarce, suggests we might exist in a narrow temporal window when observation becomes possible, making our existence both cosmically recent and precisely timed to a brief period when the universe is old enough to host life, but young enough to remain hospitable. Level 83. The Recursive Pattern. Recognition. The human brain evolved to recognize patterns because pattern recognition increased survival. Seeing the tiger in the grass, predicting seasonal changes, reading social cues. But this adaptation has the strange side effect of making us see patterns even in pure randomness, creating a coincidence where our most valuable cognitive tool also makes us vulnerable to superstition, conspiracy theories, and false connections. We're so good at pattern recognition that we can't turn it off even when we know intellectually that no pattern exists, which is why you see faces in clouds, hear hidden messages in static, and find meaning in random number sequences despite understanding that these are simply neurons misfiring in their desperate search for structure. This creates a fundamental uncertainty about coincidence. When you notice a pattern, you have no reliable internal mechanism for determining whether you're detecting a real signal or hallucinating structure that isn't there. because both real patterns and false patterns trigger the same neural circuits and produce the same feeling of meaningful recognition. The coincidence is that the cognitive system that makes science, mathematics, and complex reasoning possible is the exact same system that makes us believe in astrology, see conspiracies in random events, and interpret coincidence as cosmic communication. We're trapped inside pattern recognition machines that can't reliably distinguish between their successful function and their malfunction, making every coincidence both potentially meaningful and potentially meaningless, with no objective internal criterion for deciding which. Level 84. The Observer Causality Loop. John Wheeler's participatory universe theory suggests that the universe requires observers to exist fully, that the past isn't fixed until it's observed in the present, creating a time loop where our current observations retroactively determine what happened billions of years ago, making consciousness not a late addition to a pre-existing universe, but a necessary component that completes the causal chain by observing it. This idea emerges from quantum delayed choice experiments, where decisions made now appear to affect the behavior of photons that passed through the apparatus in the past, suggesting that causality can flow backward from observation to event, making the present moment somehow responsible for creating its own history. The coincidence this creates is profound. If observers are necessary for the universe to crystallize from quantum possibility into classical certainty, then the fact that observers exist becomes simultaneously a consequence of cosmic evolution and a prerequisite for that evolution to have occurred, creating a closed causal loop that has no beginning point. We exist because the universe evolved conditions for consciousness, but the universe only evolved those conditions because we exist to observe them having evolved, making cause and effect circular rather than linear. This framework transforms coincidence into necessity. Life emerging wasn't a lucky accident, but an inevitable requirement of a universe that needs observers to complete its own existence, meaning every unlikely coincidence that led to human consciousness was actually a predetermined outcome, working backward from the requirement of observation itself. Level 85. The Infinite Improbability. Douglas Adams joked about the Infinite Improbability drive in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a device that makes the improbable inevitable by passing through every point in probability space simultaneously. But the joke contains a serious insight about how we experience reality. Given enough time and space, every possible event that can happen will happen somewhere, making the question not, why did this improbable thing occur, but rather, why am I positioned to observe this particular improbable thing occurring to me now? You are the universe's most improbable coincidence. The specific sperm and egg that created you had approximately 1 in 400 trillion odds of combining. And that's just the final step in a chain of improbabilities extending back, through your parents meeting, your grandparents surviving long enough to reproduce, your evolutionary ancestors not being eaten, your planet forming in the habitable zone, your universe having life-permitting physical constants, meaning your existence is the culmination of so many consecutive unlikely events that the probability of you specifically existing approaches zero. Yet here you are, inevitable in retrospect. This reframes how we should think about coincidence. Unlikely events aren't violations of probability, but confirmations of it. Because in an infinite or near-infinite universe exploring all possible configurations, the improbable becomes the inevitable, and the only real surprise would be if unlikely things never happen. You are the result of the universe's infinite improbability drive, running long enough to produce every possible combination. and the coincidence of your specific consciousness existing to notice coincidences is itself the greatest coincidence of all. Level 86. The Boltzmann Brain Problem. In an infinitely old universe trending toward maximum entropy, random quantum fluctuations would occasionally assemble coherent structures purely by chance, and statistically, it's far more likely for a single disembodied brain complete with false memories to spontaneously appear than for an entire universe with consistent history to exist. Meaning you have better odds of being a Boltzmann brain, a random consciousness that popped into existence 1 second ago complete with fake memories of a lifetime, than an actual person with real history. This thought experiment reveals something disturbing about probability and existence. If the universe is old enough and random enough, conscious observers will eventually emerge through pure chance even without evolution or causality, and those chance observers will vastly outnumber real observers, making it statistically probable that you're not who you think you are, but rather a cosmic hallucination that will dissolve back into entropy moments from now. The coincidence is that your memories, identity, relationships, and entire experienced history could be completely fabricated by random quantum noise, yet feel absolutely real and continuous because the randomly assembled brain includes the neural patterns that encode false continuity. Most physicists reject the Boltzmann brain scenario by arguing that our universe isn't infinitely old, or that thermodynamic fluctuations would more likely produce simple structures than complex brains. But the argument reveals how probability, given infinite time, makes coincidence indistinguishable from causation, and makes every experience potentially suspect as random fluctuation masquerading as coherent reality. Level 87. The Eternal Return Cycle. Nietzsche proposed eternal recurrence, the idea that in an infinite universe with finite matter and energy, every possible configuration must eventually repeat, meaning you will live this exact life again an infinite number of times, making every moment occur eternally and every coincidence repeat forever across cosmic cycles. This isn't mysticism, but mathematical inevitability. If time is infinite and possible states are finite, then repetition becomes certain, not through reincarnation or spiritual law, but through exhaustive combinatorial cycling, through all possible arrangements of matter. The coincidence this creates is that everything that feels unique and meaningful about your life, your birth, your loves, your losses, this moment reading these words, has already happened infinite times before, and will happen infinite times again in exactly the same way, making novelty impossible and coincidence inevitable, because every configuration that can exist must exist repeatedly given enough time. Nietzsche used this as an ethical test. Would you be willing to live your exact life again eternally, making the same choices and experiencing the same joys and sufferings forever? Modern cosmology, with its heat-death scenarios, rejects literal eternal return. But the thought experiment reveals something about how we should value coincidence and meaning. If this moment is all there is and will never occur again, coincidence becomes precious. If this moment recurs eternally, coincidence becomes cosmic law, and the question shifts from why did this unlikely thing happen to how do I live with the knowledge that this unlikely thing will keep happening forever? Level 88. The Quantum Immortality Paradox. Many worlds' interpretation of quantum mechanics suggests that every possible outcome of every quantum event actually occurs in different branches of reality, meaning that in some branches you survive every potentially fatal event through the most improbable series of coincidences. creating a version of you that subjectively experiences immortality not through biology but through observer selection bias. You only experience the branches where you survive. This leads to the disturbing possibility that from your subjective experience, you might be functionally immortal, always finding yourself in the improbable timeline where the car swerved, the bullet missed. The cancer went into remission because the branches where you died contain no observer to experience death, collapsing your consciousness into the survival branches by default. The coincidence becomes personal and inescapable. Every close call you've survived, every near miss, every moment where you almost died but didn't, might not be luck, but rather observer selection, ensuring you always find yourself in the reality thread, where coincidence favored survival. This framework transforms how you interpret narrow escapes. They're not random good fortune, but inevitable consequences of being able to observe outcomes, meaning you will continue to experience increasingly improbable coincidental survivals as other versions of you in parallel branches die off, until eventually you're the last remaining observer thread experiencing increasingly bizarre and statistically impossible sequences of unlikely events that preserve your consciousness against mounting probability of termination. Level 89. The Fermi Paradox. Silence. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old, containing hundreds of billions of galaxies with hundreds of billions of stars each. Yet, we detect no evidence of alien civilizations, despite having the technology to notice their signals, creating the Fermi Paradox. The coincidence that we seem to be alone in a universe vast enough that intelligent life should have arisen millions of times and spread across galaxies by now. The possible explanations are equally disturbing. Either intelligent life is extraordinarily rare, and we're one of the only consciousness-harboring planets in the observable universe, or intelligent civilizations inevitably destroy themselves before achieving interstellar communication, or advanced aliens exist but are deliberately hiding from us, or we're living in a cosmic zoo being observed without contact, or intelligence is common, but the distances are too vast for communication, or we're the first civilization to reach this level, and everything that comes after depends on us not failing. Each explanation makes our existence either impossibly coincidental, the lottery winners of cosmic evolution, or terrifyingly precarious, standing on the edge of whatever filter destroys technological species before they spread. The silence of the universe transforms human existence from a predictable outcome of cosmic evolution into an anomalous coincidence that might be unique in all of space and time, making every human life not just individually improbable, but collectively unprecedented. The universe's first and possibly only attempt at self-awareness through biological consciousness. Level 90. The Fine Structure. Constant mystery. The fine structure constant, denoted alpha and approximately equal to 1 over 137, determines the strength of electromagnetic interaction and appears throughout physics with no known explanation for why it has this specific value rather than any other. And the coincidence is that if alpha were even slightly different, off by a few percent in either direction, atoms couldn't form, chemistry couldn't exist, and life would be impossible. Yet the value seems arbitrary, with no deeper principle explaining why reality chose 1 over 137 from infinite possibilities. Physicist Richard Feynman called this one of the greatest damn mysteries of physics, noting that all good theoretical physicists worry about this number because it appears in equations governing light, electricity, and matter, but derives from no known mathematical relationship or physical mechanism. The number 137 has obsessed physicists for decades, with some noting its appearance in Kabbalah and mysticism. Others finding it in unexpected places like the maximum number of electrons shells can hold, creating layers of coincidence around an unexplained constant that determines whether the universe can support complexity. What's eerie isn't just that alpha has to have some value, but that the value it has falls within the incredibly narrow range compatible with life, making our universe either extraordinarily lucky or part of a multiverse where we inevitably find ourselves in one of the rare reality configurations where the random constant happened to roll a life-permitting number, and we exist to notice the coincidence only because the coincidence occurred. Level 91. The Library of Babel Reality. Borges imagined the Library of Babel containing every possible book, every combination of letters that could form 410 pages, meaning somewhere in the library exists the true history of your life, your death date, and the answer to every question you'll ever ask. But finding those specific books among the near-infinite gibberish volumes is effectively impossible, creating a coincidence where all information exists but remains inaccessible. This metaphor describes our actual universe. Every possible arrangement of matter exists somewhere in the quantum foam of possibility. Every variation of your life is playing out in parallel branches. If many worlds is correct, every question has an answer encoded in some configuration of information. But accessing the specific arrangement you need from infinite possibility space is functionally impossible without guidance. The coincidence is that you exist in one specific volume of the cosmic library, this particular arrangement of atoms, this specific timeline, this exact sequence of experiences, when you could have existed as any of near-infinite variations, making your current configuration both completely arbitrary and absolutely singular. When you search for meaning or pattern in coincidence, you're essentially trying to navigate the Library of Babel, looking for the volume that explains why you're reading this specific text in this specific moment. But the explanation exists only in another volume you'll never find, leaving you surrounded by infinite information and answers that remain forever inaccessible, because the library is too vast to search completely, making meaningful coincidence both certain to exist somewhere and impossible to verify. Level 92. The Consciousness Binding Problem. Neuroscience cannot explain how billions of individual neurons firing in patterns somehow create the unified subjective experience of being you. Why all those separate electrical impulses bind together into one coherent consciousness rather than remaining disconnected processes, creating what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, where the coincidence of unified awareness emerging from distributed brain activity has no mechanistic explanation. We can map which neurons fire when you see red or feel pain or remember your childhood, but we cannot explain why those neural patterns feel like anything at all, why there's an interior subjective experience accompanying the brain's mechanical information processing. The coincidence becomes acute when you consider split brain patients whose corpus callosum is severed, creating two separate consciousnesses within one skull, each unaware of the other, suggesting that unified experience isn't a fundamental property of brains, but rather a coincidental consequence of neural connectivity that can be disrupted or duplicated. If consciousness is unified only because brain regions communicate, then you are a temporary coincidence of synchronized neural firing that dissolves every night during sleep and reconstructs each morning, making personal identity less a continuous thing and more a recurring pattern that coincidentally maintains coherence across time through memory and habit. Every moment of unified awareness is a small miracle of binding, where disparate brain processes coincidentally coordinate to create the illusion of single perspective observing reality from one point in space-time. Level 93. The Omega Point Convergence. Physicist Frank Tipler proposed that the universe's evolution might culminate in an omega point, a final moment of infinite computational power where all possible information is processed. All consciousness that ever existed is resurrected in simulation, and the universe achieves total self-awareness, making your current existence just one point on a trajectory toward inevitable cosmic consciousness. This theory suggests that coincidences aren't random, but rather attractor states pulling reality toward configurations that maximize information processing and complexity, making life and consciousness not accidents, but necessary steps in the universe's evolution toward total self-reflection. The coincidence becomes teleological. Everything that seems random, the fine-tuned constants, the emergence of life, the development of technology, might be deterministic consequences of the universe optimizing toward maximum awareness, with each unlikely event not actually unlikely, but rather inevitable, given the endpoint the system is evolving toward. If the omega point exists in the future, then causality might flow backward from that ultimate state, organizing present events to ensure the timeline leads where it needs to go, making your existence and every coincidence you experience not random chance but necessary components of the universe's path to full consciousness. This framework transforms coincidence from meaningless noise into encoded signals from the future organizing the present. Though whether that's comforting or terrifying depends on whether you want your life to have cosmic purpose or prefer the freedom of genuine randomness. Level 94. The Quantum Zeno Effect. Repeatedly observing a quantum system can prevent it from evolving, a phenomenon called the quantum Zeno effect, where the act of measurement itself freezes change, creating a coincidence where consciousness directly interferes with physical processes through nothing more than observation, making a watched pot never boils literally true at quantum scales. This effect demonstrates that the boundary between observer and observed isn't as clear as classical physics assumed. Looking at something isn't passive reception, but active intervention that alters the system being viewed. The coincidence extends to larger scales through implications. If consciousness affects quantum events, and quantum events underlie all physical processes through cumulative effect, then sustained attention might actually influence macroscopic reality in ways we dismiss as magical thinking, but which physics allows at fundamental levels. This doesn't mean you can manifest a parking space through positive thinking, but it does suggest that the relationship between mind and matter is stranger than materialist frameworks acknowledge. That observation itself is a form of causation operating through mechanisms we barely understand. The watched pot eventually boils at macroscopic scales because thermal systems average out quantum effects. But at the boundary between quantum and classical, consciousness might exert genuine influence on outcomes through the mechanism of observation-collapsing superposition, making coincidences between intention and manifestation less mystical and more consistent with physics. If we're willing to accept that looking at reality participates in creating what we see. Level 95. The Anthropic Shadow Effect. Observer selection bias creates an anthropic shadow, where you systematically underestimate catastrophic risks because observers who experienced the catastrophe don't exist to report it, making the coincidence that civilization has survived so far appear more reassuring than it should be given actual risk levels. For example, we've never experienced a civilization-ending asteroid impact during recorded history, But that doesn't mean such impacts are rare. It might mean that the timelines where they occurred during human civilization contain no observers to notice the coincidence of survival, biasing our sample toward realities where catastrophe hasn't struck yet. This creates a disturbing possibility. We might be living in the improbable tail end of a probability distribution, experiencing an unlikely string of coincidental survivals. No nuclear war, no pandemic worse than COVID, no asteroid strike. Not because these risks are low, but because the branches where they happened have no humans left to update probability estimates. Every day without catastrophe feels like evidence that catastrophe is unlikely, but Anthropic shadow suggests the opposite. The longer we survive, the more we should suspect we're in an improbable timeline that's statistically due for regression to the mean. The coincidence of your existence means you necessarily find yourself in a survival timeline, but that survival timeline might be far more precarious than it appears. A lucky streak masquerading as stability, with no way to tell from inside the surviving branch whether you're in a genuinely low-risk reality or just the last remaining observer in a high-risk one that keeps rolling the dice without catastrophic outcome. Level 96. The Meaning-Making Machine. Your brain is fundamentally a prediction engine that creates models of reality and tests them against incoming data, constantly searching for patterns that improve predictive accuracy, which means that meaning isn't something you discover in external reality, but rather something your neural architecture generates and projects outward, making every coincidence simultaneously real, as a pattern in data and constructed as significance assigned by interpretation. This creates a strange ontological status for coincidence. The temporal alignment or numerical pattern actually exists as objective fact, but the sense that it means something, that it's trying to tell you something or represents cosmic communication, is purely internal. A story your pattern recognition systems tell to make sense of correlation. The coincidence is that humans evolved brains capable of seeing meaning everywhere because our ancestors who noticed patterns, real or imagined, survived better than those who didn't, leaving us with neural machinery that cannot stop generating significance even when explicitly told that none exists. You cannot turn off meaning-making any more than you can stop seeing optical illusions after learning how they work. The machinery operates automatically, below conscious control, flooding your awareness with interpreted significance regardless of whether the patterns it detects represent genuine signal or pure noise. This means living with permanent uncertainty about which coincidences matter and which don't, because the feeling of significance is identical for both, and your internal meaning detector was optimized for false positives rather than accuracy, preferring to see patterns that aren't there over missing patterns that are. Level 97. The Cosmic Perspective Shift. When astronauts view Earth from space, many report a profound psychological shift called the overview effect, where seeing the planet as a small blue marble floating in void produces instant perspective on the absurdity of human conflict and the preciousness of the coincidence that we exist at all on this improbable oasis of complexity in a mostly dead universe. This perspective reveals that most of what feels important, your career anxieties, social status, daily frustrations, is cosmically irrelevant, occurring on a scale so small and brief that it barely registers as a blip in space-time, yet simultaneously reveals that the mere fact of your consciousness existing to worry about these trivial things is itself the greatest coincidence in observable reality. The shift creates a productive tension. Everything human feels simultaneously meaningless. We're dust specks on a rock hurtling through void, and infinitely precious. We're self-aware, dust capable of contemplating our own improbability. Every coincidence you've encountered in these 100 levels operates within this tension, appearing either as meaningless statistical noise when viewed from cosmic distance, or as profound synchronicity when experienced from inside a human life constrained by limited time and perspective. The astronaut's view suggests that the right way to relate to coincidence isn't choosing between these interpretations, but holding both simultaneously. Acknowledging that your life is statistically inevitable, given enough planets and time, while also honoring that from your subjective position, the specific coincidences you experience feel unrepeatable and meaningful, regardless of their objective probability. Level 98. The Acceptance of Mystery. After examining 100 coincidences ranging from historical parallels to quantum weirdness, the honest conclusion is that we still don't know whether coincidence represents pure randomness, hidden causal patterns we haven't discovered, consciousness interacting with matter in ways physics doesn't fully understand, or something else entirely beyond current conceptual frameworks. Science has explained many things that seemed mysterious, but it has also revealed deeper mysteries at every layer. Quantum mechanics is more confusing than classical physics. Neuroscience makes consciousness more puzzling rather than less. Cosmology discovers dark matter and dark energy that make up 95% of the universe while remaining completely unexplained. The coincidence is that increased knowledge doesn't reduce mystery, but rather relocates it, pushing the boundary of unknown further out, but never eliminating it, suggesting that reality might be fundamentally inexhaustible, containing infinite layers of pattern and strangeness no matter how deeply we investigate. Living with this requires abandoning the need for complete explanation and developing comfort with irreducible uncertainty, accepting that some coincidences will never be satisfactorily explained, because explanation itself might be a limited tool unable to capture everything reality contains. The healthy response isn't scientific dismissal, it's just confirmation bias, nor mystical inflation. It's proof of cosmic consciousness, but rather open-handed acknowledgement. Strange things happen, patterns emerge, meaning surfaces, and we don't and may never fully understand why. And that's acceptable, even necessary, because mystery is the substrate that makes curiosity and wonder possible. Level 99. The Choice of Interpretation. You've now heard 100 coincidences, each one genuinely documented, each one statistically improbable, each one capable of supporting radically different interpretations depending on the framework you choose to apply. Pure chance, mathematical inevitability, quantum mechanics, consciousness effects, simulation theory, divine intervention, or something else entirely. The coincidence is that the same data supports contradictory explanations equally well, meaning your choice of interpretation reveals more about your cognitive style and emotional needs than about the coincidences themselves, making meaning not a property of events, but a relationship between events and the consciousness observing them. Some people need coincidences to be meaningless to maintain psychological comfort, finding security in randomness and statistical explanation because it makes reality predictable and controllable. Others need coincidences to be meaningful to maintain psychological comfort, finding security in pattern and synchronicity because it makes reality intentional and responsive. Neither approach is objectively correct. Both are coping strategies for managing the ontological uncertainty of existence in a reality that refuses to declare its own nature clearly. The choice you make, whether to see these 100 coincidences as random noise or meaningful pattern, will shape your experience of being alive. influencing whether you move through the world as an isolated consciousness buffeted by chaos, or as a connected participant in an intelligent universe, and both choices have costs and benefits, neither can be proven, and you must choose anyway, because refusing to choose is itself a choice with consequences. What matters isn't which interpretation is true, but which relationship to coincidence helps you live most fully, most courageously, and most compassionately in the face of irreducible uncertainty. Level 100. The coincidence of consciousness. The greatest coincidence isn't any of the 100 you've heard tonight, but rather the fact that you exist to hear them at all. That matter arranged itself into patterns capable of self-awareness, that the universe evolved observers able to notice its own strangeness, that consciousness emerged from unconscious processes and now contemplates the improbability of its own existence. You are the universe examining itself, a temporary configuration of atoms that somehow produces the interior experience of being someone, of having preferences and memories, and the ability to wonder about coincidence and meaning. This is so fundamentally weird that no explanation fully captures it. We can describe neural correlates of consciousness, but not why those correlates feel like anything. We can trace evolutionary development of complex brains, but not why complexity produces subjective experience. We can map cognitive processes, but not why there's someone home to experience the mapping. Every coincidence you've encountered tonight, temporal alignments, numerical patterns, precognitive dreams, quantum effects, is less strange than the basic fact of your awareness existing to notice them, because that awareness has no satisfying explanation in purely material terms, yet obviously exists because you're experiencing it right now. Perhaps the answer to why do coincidences happen is inseparable from why does consciousness exist to notice them? Both questions pointing toward the same mystery, that reality contains pattern, structure, and observation bound together in ways we experience directly but cannot explain completely. You are the coincidence examining coincidence, improbability contemplating improbability. The universe's attempt to understand itself through the temporary medium of human awareness, and whether that makes your life meaningless or infinitely precious depends entirely on which story you choose to tell about the strange fact that you're here at all, noticing patterns in chaos and finding meaning in noise, a conscious witness to reality's endless capacity for surprise.